Chapter 1. Death surrounded her. She faced it daily, dreamed of it nightly, lived with it always. She knew its sounds, its scents, even its texture. She could look in its dark and clever eye without a flinch. Death was a tricky foe, she knew. One flinch, one blink, and it could shift, it could change, it could win. 10 years as a cop hadn't hardened her toward it. A decade on the force hadn't made her accept it. When she looked death in the eye, it was with the cold steel of the warrior. Eve Dallas looked at death now, and she looked at one of her own. Frank Wojcinski had been a good cop, solid. Some would have said plodding. He'd been affable, she remembered. A man who hadn't complained about the bilge disguised as food at the NYPSD eatery, or the eye-searing paperwork the job generated. Or, Eve thought, about the fact that he'd been 62 and had never made it past the rank of detective sergeant. He'd been on the pudgy side and had let his hair gray and thin naturally. It was a rare thing in 2058 for a man to bypass body sculpting and enhancements. Now, in his clear-sided view casket, with its single spray of mournful lilies, he resembled a peacefully sleeping monk from an earlier time. He'd been born in an earlier time, Eve mused, coming into the world at the end of one millennium and living his life in the next. He'd been through the urban wars, but hadn't talked of them as so many of the older cops did. Frank hadn't been one for war stories, she recalled. He was more likely to pass around the latest snapshot or hologram of his children and grandchildren. He liked to tell bad jokes, talk sports, and had a weakness for soy dogs with spiced pickle relish. A family man, she thought, one who left behind great grief. Indeed, she could think of no one who had known Frank Wojcinski who hadn't loved him. He had died with half his life still ahead of him, died alone, when the heart everyone had thought so huge and so strong had just stopped. God damn it! Eve turned, laid a hand on the arm of the man who stepped up beside her. I'm sorry, Feeney. He shook his head, his droopy camel's eyes filled with misery. With one hand he raked through his wiry red hair. On the job would have been easier. I could handle line of duty, but to just stop, to just check out in his easy chair watching arena ball on the screen, it's not right, Dallas. A man's not supposed to stop living at his age. I know. Not knowing what else to do, Eve draped an arm over his shoulder and steered him away. He trained me. Looked after me when I was a rookie. Never let me down. Pain radiated through him and glinted dully in his eyes, wavered in his voice. Frank never let anyone down in his life. I know, she said again, because there was nothing else that could be said. She was accustomed to Feeney being tough and strong. The delicacy of his grief worried her. She led him through the mourners. The viewing room was packed with cops as well as family, and where there were cops and death, there was coffee, or what passed for it at such places. She poured a cup, handed it to him. I can't get around it. I can't get a hold of it. He let out a long, uneven breath. He was a sturdy, compact man who wore his grief as openly as he wore his rumpled coat. I haven't talked to Sally yet. My wife's with her. I just can't do it. It's all right. I haven't talked to her either. Since she had nothing to do with her hands, Eve poured a cup for herself that she didn't intend to drink. Everybody shook up by this. I didn't know he had a heart problem. Nobody did, Feeney said quietly. Nobody knew. She kept a hand on his shoulder as she scanned the overcrowded, overwarm room. When a fellow officer went down in the line of duty, cops could be angry. They could be focused, fix their target. But when death snuck in and crooked a capricious finger, there was no one to blame, and no one to punish. Helplessness she felt in the room, and that she felt in herself. You couldn't raise your weapon to fate, or your fist. The funeral director, spiffy in his traditional black suit and as waxy-faced as one of his own clients, worked the room with patting hands and sober eyes. Eve thought she'd rather have a corpse sit up and grin at her than listen to his platitudes. Why don't we go talk to the family together? It was hard for him, but Feeney nodded, set the untouched coffee aside. He liked you, Dallas. That kid's got balls of steel and a mind to match, he used to tell me. He always said if he was ever jammed, you'd be the one he'd want guarding his back. It surprised and pleased her, and it simultaneously added to her sorrow. I didn't realize he thought of me that way. Feeney looked at her. She had an interesting face, not one he'd have called a heart-stopper, but it usually made a man look twice with its angles and sharp bones, the shallow dent in the chin. She had cop's eyes, intense and measuring, and he often forgot they were a dark golden brown. Her hair was the same shade, cut short and badly in need of some shaping. She was tall and lean and tough-bodied. He remembered it had been less than a month since he had come across her, battered and bloodied, but her weapon had been firm in her hand. He thought of you that way. So do I. While she blinked at him, Feeney squared his hunched shoulders. Let's talk to Sally and the kids. They slipped through the crowd, jammed together in a room oppressed with dark, simulated wood, heavy red draperies, and the funereal smell of too many flowers crammed into too small a space. Eve wondered why viewings of the dead were always accompanied by flowers and draping sheets of red. What ancient ceremony did it spring from? And why did the human race continue to cling to it? She was certain that when her time came, she wouldn't choose to be laid out for study by her loved ones and associates in an overheated room where the pervasive scent of flowers was reminiscent of rot. Then she saw Sally, supported by her children and her children's children, and realized such rites were for the living. The dead were beyond caring. Ryan. Sally held out her hands, small, almost fairy-like hands, and lifted her cheek to Feeney's. She held there a moment, her eyes closed, her face pale and quiet. She was a slim, soft-spoken woman who Eve had always thought of as delicate. Yet a cop spouse who had survived the stress of the job for more than 40 years had to have steel. Against her plain black dress, she wore her husband's 25-year NYPSD ring on a chain. Another rite, Eve thought. Another symbol. I'm so glad you're here, Sally murmured. I'll miss him. We'll all miss him. Feeney patted her back awkwardly before drawing away. Grief was in his throat, choking him. Swallowing it only lodged it cold and heavy in his gut. You know, if there's anything... I know. Her lips curved slightly, and she gave his hand a quick and comforting squeeze before turning to Eve. I appreciate you coming, Dallas. He was a good man, a solid cop. Yes, he was. Recognizing it as high tribute, Sally managed to smile. He was proud to serve and protect. Commander Whitney and his wife are here, and Chief Tibble, and so many others. Her gaze drifted blindly around the room. So many. He mattered. Frank mattered. Of course he did, Sally. Feeney shifted from foot to foot. You, know about the Survivors Fund. She smiled again, patted his hand. We're fine there. Don't worry. Dallas, I don't think you really know my family. Lieutenant Dallas, my daughter Brenda. Short with rounded curves, Eve noted as they clasped hands. Dark hair and eyes, a bit heavy in the chin. Took after her father. My son Curtis. Slim, small-boned, soft hands, eyes that were dry but dazed with grief. My grandchildren. There were 5 of them, the youngest a boy of about 8, with a pug nose dashed with freckles. He eyed Eve consideringly. How come you've got your zapper on? Flustered, Eve tugged her jacket over her sidearm. I came straight from Cop Central. I didn't have time to go home and change. Pete. Curtis shot Eve an apologetic wince. Don't bother the lieutenant. If people concentrated more on their personal and spiritual powers, what would be unnecessary? I'm Alice. A slim blonde in black stepped forward. She'd have been a stunner in any case, Eve mused, but having sprung from such basic stock, she was dazzling. Her eyes were a soft, dreamy blue, her mouth full and lush and unpainted. She wore her hair loose so that it rained straight and glossy over the shoulders of her flowing black dress. A thin silver chain fell to her waist. At the end of it was a black stone ringed in silver. "Alice, you're such a ziphead." She flicked a cool glance over her shoulder toward a boy of about 16, but her hands kept fluttering back to the black stone like elegant birds guarding a nest. "My brother Jamie," she said in a silky voice. "He still thinks name-calling deserves a reaction. My grandfather spoke of you, Lieutenant Dallas." "I'm flattered." "Your husband isn't with you tonight?" Eve arched a brow. Not just grief, she deduced, but nerves. It was easy enough to recognize. Signals as well, but they weren't clear. The girl was after something, she mused. But what? "No, he's not." She shifted her gaze back to Sally. "He sends his sympathies, Mrs. Wojcinski. He's off-planet." "It must take a great deal of concentration and energy," Alice interrupted, "to maintain a relationship with a man like Rourke while pursuing a demanding, difficult, even dangerous career. My grandfather used to say that once you had a grip on an investigation, you never let go. Would you say that's accurate, Lieutenant?" "If you let go, you lose. I don't like to lose." She held Alice's odd gaze for a moment, then on impulse crouched down and whispered to Pete. "When I was a rookie, I saw your grandfather zap a guy at 10 yards. He was the best." She was rewarded with a quick grin before she straightened. "He won't be forgotten, Mrs. Wojcinski," she said, offering her hand. "And he mattered very much to all of us." She started to step back, but Alice laid a hand on her arm, leaned close. The hand, Eve noted, trembled slightly. "It was interesting meeting you, Lieutenant. Thank you for coming." Eve inclined her head and slipped back into the crowd. Casually, she reached a hand into the pocket of her jacket and fingered the thin slip of paper Alice had pushed inside. It took her another 30 minutes to get away. She waited until she was outside and in her vehicle before she took the note out and read it. "Meet me tomorrow, midnight, Aquarian Club. Tell no one. Your life is now at risk." In lieu of a signature, there was a symbol, a dark line running in an expanding circle to form a sort of maze. Nearly as intrigued as she was annoyed, Eve stuffed the note back in her pocket and started home. Because she was a cop, she saw the figure draped in black, hardly more than a shadow in the shadows. And because she was a cop, she knew he was watching her. Whenever Rourke was away, Eve preferred to pretend the house was empty. Both she and Somerset, who served as Rourke's chief of staff, did their best to ignore the other's presence. The house was huge, a labyrinth of rooms, which made it a simple matter to avoid one another. She stepped into the wide foyer, tossed her scarred leather jacket over the carved newel post, because she knew it would make Somerset grind his teeth. He detested having anything mar the elegance of the house, particularly her. She took the stairs, but rather than go to the master bedroom, she veered off to her office suite. If Rourke had to spend another night off-planet as expected, she preferred to spend hers in her relaxation chair rather than their bed. She often dreamed badly when she dreamed alone. Between the late paperwork and the viewing, she hadn't had time for a meal. She ordered up a sandwich, real Virginia ham on rye, and coffee that jumped with genuine caffeine. When the auto chef delivered, she inhaled the scent slowly, greedily. She took the first bite with her eyes closed to better enjoy the miracle. There were definite advantages to being married to a man who could afford real meat instead of its byproducts and simulations. To satisfy her curiosity, she went to her desk and engaged her computer. She swallowed ham, chased it with coffee. All available data on subject Alice, surname unknown. Mother Brenda, formerly Wojcinski. Maternal grandparents Frank and Sally Wojcinski. Working. Eve drummed her fingers, took out the note and reread it while she polished off the quick meal. Subject Lingstrom. Date of birth June 10, 2040. First child and only daughter of Jan Lingstrom and Brenda Wojcinski, divorced. Residence 486 West 8th Street, apartment 4B, New York City. Sibling James Lingstrom. Date of birth March 22, 2042. Education high school graduate, valedictorian. 2 semesters of college, Harvard, major anthropology. minor, mythology. Third semester deferred. Currently employed as clerk, Spirit Quest, 228 West 10th Street, New York City. Marital status, single. Eve ran her tongue around her teeth. Criminal record? No criminal record. Sounds fairly normal, Eve murmured. Data on Spirit Quest. Spirit Quest, Wiccan Shop and Consultation Center, owned by Isis Page and Charles Forte. 3 years in 10th Street location. Annual gross income, $125,000. Licensed priestess, herbalist, and registered hypnotherapist on site. Wicca? Eve leaned back with a snort. Witch stuff? Jesus, what kind of scam is this? Wicca, recognized as both a religion and a craft, is an ancient, nature-based faith which— Stop! Eve blew out a breath. She wasn't looking for a definition of witchcraft, but an explanation as to why a steady-as-a-rock cop ended up with a granddaughter who believed in casting spells and magic crystals. And why that granddaughter wanted a secret meeting. The best way to find out, she decided, was to show up at the Aquarian Club in a bit over 24 hours. She left the note on the desk. It would be easy to dismiss it, she thought, if it hadn't been written by a relative of a man she'd respected. And if she hadn't seen that figure in the shadows, a figure she was sure hadn't wanted to be seen. She walked to the adjoining bath and began to strip. It was too bad she couldn't take Mavis with her for the meet. Eve had a feeling the Aquarian Club would be right up her friend's alley. Eve kicked her jeans aside, leaned over to stretch out the kinks of a long day, and wondered what she would do with the long night ahead. She had nothing hot to work on. Her last homicide had been so open and shut that she and her aide had put it to bed in under 8 hours. Maybe she'd spend a couple hours glazing out watching some screen. Or she could pick a weapon out of Rourke's gun room and go down and run a hologram program to burn off excess energy until she could sleep. She'd never tried one of his auto-assault rifles. It might be interesting to experience how a cop took out an enemy during the early days of the urban wars. She stepped into the shower. Full jets, on pulse, she ordered. 98 degrees. She wished she had a murder to sink her teeth into. Something that would focus her mind and drain her system. And damn it, that was pathetic. She was lonely, she realized, desperate for a distraction. And he'd only been gone 3 days. They both had their own lives, didn't they? They'd lived them before they met and continued to live them after. The demands of both their businesses absorbed much time and attention. Their relationship worked, and that continued to surprise her, because they were both independent people. Christ, she missed him outrageously. Disgusted with herself, she ducked her head under the spray and let it pound on her brain. When hands slipped around her waist, then slid up to cup her breasts, she barely jolted. But her heart leaped. She knew his touch, the feel of those long, slim fingers, the texture of those wide palms. She tipped her head back, inviting a mouth to the curve of her shoulder. Somerset, you wild man. Teeth nipped into flesh and made her chuckle. Thumbs brushed over her soapy nipples and made her moan. I'm not going to fire him. Rourke trailed a hand down the center of her body. It was worth a shot. You're back. His fingers dipped expertly inside her, slick and slippery, so that she arched, moaned, and came simultaneously. Early, she finished on an explosive breath. God! I'd say I was just on time. He spun her around, and while she was shuddering and blinking water out of her eyes, he covered her mouth in a long, ravenous kiss. He'd thought about her on the interminable flight home. Thought about this, just this, touching and tasting and hearing that quick catch in her breath as he did. And here she was, naked and wet and already quivering for him. He braced her in the corner, gripped her hips, and slowly lifted her off her feet. Miss me? Her heart was thundering. He was inches away from driving into her, filling her, destroying her. Not really. Well, in that case. He kissed her lightly on the chin. I'll just let you finish your shower in peace. In a flash, she wrapped her legs around his waist, took a firm hold of his wet mane of hair. Try it, pal, and you're a dead man. In the interest of self-preservation, then. To torture them both, he slipped into her slowly, watched her eyes go opaque. He closed his mouth over hers again, so that her shallow breaths shuddered through him. The ride was slow and slippery and more tender than either had expected. Climax came on a long, quiet sigh. Her lips curved against his. "Welcome home." She could see him now, those stunning blue eyes, the face that was both saint and sinner, the mouth of a doomed poet. His hair was streaming with water, black and sleek, just touching broad shoulders, roped with subtle and surprisingly tough muscle. Looking at him after these brief, periodic absences always made something unexpected lurch through her. She doubted she would ever get used to the fact that he not only wanted her, but loved her. She was smiling still as she combed her fingers through his thick black hair. "Everything okay with the Olympus resort?" "Adjustments, some delays, nothing that can't be dealt with." The elaborate space station resort and pleasure center would open on schedule, because he wouldn't accept any less. He ordered the jets off, then took a towel to wrap around her when she would have used the drying tube. "I began to understand why you stay in here while I'm away. I couldn't sleep in the presidential suite." He took another towel, rubbed it over her hair. "It was too lonely without you." She leaned against him a moment, just to feel the familiar lines of his body against hers. "We're getting so damn sappy." "I don't mind. We Irish are very sentimental." It made her smirk as he turned to get robes. He might have had the music of Ireland in his voice, but she seriously doubted if any of his business friends or foes would consider Rourke a sentimental man. "No fresh bruises," he observed, helping her into her robe before she could do it for herself. "I take that to mean that you've had a quiet few days." "Mostly. We had a John get a bit over-enthusiastic with a licensed companion. Choked her to death during sex." She belted the robe, scratched fingers through her hair to scatter more water. He got spooked and ran. She moved her shoulders as she stepped into the office, but he lawyered up and turned himself in a few hours later. PA took it down to manslaughter. "I let Peabody handle the interview and booking." Rourke went to a recessed cabinet for wine, poured them both a glass. "It's been quiet, then?" "Yeah. I had that viewing tonight." His brow furrowed, then cleared. "Ah, yes, you told me. I'm sorry I couldn't make it home in time to be with you. Feeney's taking it really hard. It would be easier if Frank had gone down in the line of duty." This time Rourke's brow quirked. "You'd prefer that your associate had been killed rather than, say, go gently into that good night? I just understand it better, that's all." She frowned into her wine. She didn't think it wise to tell Rourke she'd prefer a fast and violent death herself. "There is something odd, though. I met Frank's family. The oldest granddaughter's on the weird side." "How?" "The way she talked, and the data I accessed on her after I got home." Intrigued, he lifted his wine to sip. "You ran a make on her?" "Just a quick check, because she passed me this." Eve walked to the desk, picked up the note. Rourke scanned it, considered. "Earth Labyrinth." "What?" "The symbol here. It's Celtic." Shaking her head, Eve eased closer to look again. "You know the strangest things." "Not so strange. I spring from the Celts, after all. The ancient labyrinth symbol is magical and sacred." "Well, it fits. She's into witchcraft or something. Got herself the start of a top-flight education, Harvard, but she drops out to work in some West Village shop that sells crystals and magic herbs." Rourke traced the symbol with a fingertip. He'd seen it before, and others like it. During his childhood, the cults in Dublin had run the range between vicious gangs and pious pacifists. All, of course, had used religion as the excuse to kill. Or be killed. "You have no idea why she wants to meet you?" "None. I'd say she figures she read my aura or something. Mavis ran a mystic grift before I busted her for pinching wallets. She told me people will pay most anything if you tell them what they want to hear. More if you tell them what they don't want to hear. Which is why comms and legitimate businesses are very much the same. He smiled at her. I take it you're going anyway. Sure, I'll follow through. Naturally, she would. Rourke glanced at the note again, then set it aside. I'm going with you. It's a pity what she wants. He sipped his wine, a man accustomed to getting precisely what he wanted, one way or another. I'll stay out of your way, but I'm going. The Aquarian Club is basically harmless, but there are always unsavory elements that leak through. Unsavory elements are my life, she said soberly, then cocked her head. You don't, own the Aquarian, do you? No, he smiled. Would you like to? She laughed and took his hand. Come on, let's drink this in bed. Relaxed by sex and wine, she fell peacefully asleep, draped around by Rourke. That's why she was baffled to find herself suddenly and fully awake only 2 hours later. It hadn't been one of her nightmares. There was no terror, no pain, no cold, clammy sweat. Yet she had snapped awake, and her heart wasn't quite steady. She lay still, staring up through the wide sky window over the bed, listening to Rourke's quiet, steady breathing beside her. She shifted, glanced down at the foot of the bed, and nearly yelped when eyes glowed out of the dark. Then she registered the weight over her ankles. Galahad, she thought, and rolled her eyes. The cat had come in and jumped onto the bed. That's what had awakened her, she told herself. That's all it was. She settled again, turned onto her side, and felt Rourke's arms slide around her in sleep. On a sigh, she closed her eyes, snuggled companionably against him. Just the cat, she thought sleepily. But she would have sworn she'd heard chanting. Chapter 2. By the time Eve was elbow-deep in paperwork the next morning, the odd wakefulness in the night was forgotten. New York seemed to be content to bask in the balmy days of early autumn and behave itself. It seemed like a good time to take a few hours and organize her office. Or rather, to delegate Peabody to organize it. How can your files be this skewed? Peabody demanded. Her earnest square face expressed deep remorse and disappointment. I know where everything is, Eve told her. I want you to put everything where I'll still know where it is, but where it also makes sense for it to be. Too tough an assignment, officer. I can handle it. Peabody rolled her eyes behind Eve's back. Sir. Fine, and don't roll your eyes at me. If things are a bit skewed, as you put it, it's because I've had a busy year. As we're in the last quarter of this one, and I'm training you, it falls to me to dump this on you. Eve turned and smiled thinly. With the hope, Peabody, that you will one day have an underling to dump shit assignments on. Your faith in me is touching, Dallas. Chokes me up. She hissed at the computer. Or maybe it's the fact that you've got yellow sheets in here from 5 years ago that's choking me. These should have been downloaded to the main and cleared out of your unit after 24 months. So download and clear now. Eve's smile widened as the machine hacked, then droned out a warning of system failure. And good luck. Technology can be our friend, and like any friendship, it requires regular maintenance and understanding. I understand it fine. Eve stepped over, pounded her fist twice on the drive. The unit hiccuped back into running mode. See? You have a real smooth touch, Lieutenant. That's why the guys in maintenance shoot air darts at your picture. Still? Christ, they hold a grudge. With a shrug, Eve sat on the corner of the desk. What do you know about witchcraft? If you want to cast a spell on your machine here, Dallas, it's a little out of my field. Teeth clenched, she juggled and compressed files. You're a free ager. Lapsed. Come on, you can do it, she muttered at the computer. Besides, she added, agers aren't Wiccans. They're both Earth religions, and both are based on natural orders, but son of a bitch, where'd it go? What? Where did what go? Nothing. Shoulders hunched, Peabody guarded the monitor. Nothing, don't worry, I'm on it. You probably didn't need those files anyway. Is that a joke, Peabody? You bet. Ha ha. A line of sweat dribbled down her back as she attacked the keys. There it is. No problem at all. And off it goes into the main. Neat and tidy. She let out an enormous sigh. Could I maybe have some coffee, just to keep alert? Eve shifted her gaze to the screen, saw nothing that looked ominous. Saying nothing, she rose and ordered coffee from the auto chef. Why do you want to know about Wicca? You thinking of converting? At Eve's bland look, Peabody tried a smile. Another joke? You're full of them today. Just curious. Well, there's some overlap on basic tenets between Wiccans and free-agers. A search for balance and harmony, the celebration of the seasons that goes back to ancient times, the strict code of nonviolence. Nonviolence? Eve narrowed her eyes. What about curses, casting spells and sacrifices, naked virgins on the altar and black roosters getting their heads chopped off? Fiction depicts witches that way. You know, double, toil and trouble. Shakespeare, Macbeth. Eve snorted. I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too. The Wicked Witch of the West, classic vid channel. Good one, Peabody admitted. But both examples feed into the most basic of misconceptions. Witches aren't ugly, evil crones mixing up cauldrons of goop or hunting down young girls and their friendly talking scarecrows. Wiccans like to be naked, but they don't hurt anything or anyone. Strictly white magic. As opposed to black magic. Eve studied her aide. You don't believe in that stuff? Magic and spells? Nope. Revived with coffee, Peabody turned back to the computer. I know some of the basics because I have a cousin who shifted to Wicca. He's into it big time. Joined a coven in Cincinnati. You've got a cousin in a coven in Cincinnati? Laughing, Eve set her own coffee aside. Peabody, you never cease to amaze me. One day I'll tell you about my granny and her 5 lovers. 5 lovers isn't abnormal for a woman's lifetime. Not in her lifetime, last month. All at the same time. Peabody glanced up deadpan. She's 98. I hope to take after her. Eve swallowed her next chuckle as her telelink beeped. Dallas. She watched Commander Whitney's face swim on screen. Yes, Commander. I'd like to speak with you, Lieutenant, in my office, as soon as possible. Yes, sir, 5 minutes. Eve disengaged, shot a hopeful glance at Peabody. Maybe we've got something going. Keep working on those files. I'll contact you if we're heading out. She started out, stuck her head back in. Don't eat my candy bar. Damn, Peabody said under her breath. She never misses. Whitney had spent most of his life behind a badge, and a large part of his professional life in command. He made it his business to know his cops, to judge their strengths and weaknesses, and he knew how to utilize both. He was a big man with working-man hands and dark, keen eyes that some considered cold. His temperament, on the surface, was almost terrifyingly even, and like most smooth surfaces, it coated something dangerous brewing beneath. Eve respected him, occasionally liked him, and always admired him. He was at his desk when she stepped into his office, lines of concentration puckering his brow as he read over some hard copy. He didn't glance up, merely gestured toward a chair. She sat, watched an air tram rumble by his window, baffled as always by the number of passengers with binocs and spyglasses. What did they expect to see behind the windows where cops worked, she wondered? Suspects being tortured, weapons discharged, victims bleeding and weeping? And why would the fantasy of such misery entertain them? I saw you at the viewing last night. Eve shifted her thoughts and attention to her commander. I imagine most every cop in Central made an appearance. Frank was well-liked. Yes, he was. You never worked with him? He gave me some pointers when I was a rookie, out on legwork a couple of times, but no, I never worked with him directly. Whitney nodded, kept his eyes on hers. He was partnered with Feeney before your time. You were partnered with Feeney after Frank shifted from the streets to a desk. She began to get an uncomfortable feeling in the gut. Something here, she thought. Something's off. Yes, sir. This has hit Feeney pretty hard.
I'm aware of that, Dallas, which is why Captain Feeney isn't here this morning.
Whitney propped his elbows on his desk, linked his fingers, folded his fingers over.
We have a possible situation, Lieutenant. A delicate situation.
Regarding D.S. Wojcinski?
The information I'm going to relay to you is confidential. Your aid can be apprised per your discretion, but no one else on the force. No one in the media. I am asking you, ordering you, he corrected, to essentially work alone on this matter.
The discomfort in her stomach spread into little licks of fear as she thought of Feeney. Understood.
There is some question regarding the circumstances of D.S. Wojcinski's death.
Question, Commander?
You'll require some background data.
He laid his folded hands on the edge of the desk.
It has come to my attention that D.S. Wojcinski was either pursuing an investigation of his own off the clock or involved with illegals.
Drugs, Frank? Nobody was cleaner than Frank. Whitney didn't so much as blink.
On September 22nd of this year, D.S. Wojcinski was spotted by an undercover illegals detective allegedly conducting business in a suspected chemical distribution center. The Athame is a private club, religious in theme, which offers its members group and individual ritual services and is licensed for private sexual functions. The Illegals Division has had it under investigation for nearly 2 years. Frank was seen making a buy.
When Eve said nothing, Whitney drew a long breath.
This situation was subsequently reported to me. I questioned Frank, and he was not forthcoming.
Whitney hesitated, then followed through.
Frankly, Dallas, the fact that he would neither confirm nor deny, refuse to explain or discuss, seemed very out of character, and it worried me. I ordered him to submit to a physical, including a drug scan, advised him to take a week's leave. He agreed to both. The scan was, at that point, clear. Due to his record and my personal knowledge and opinion of him, I did not mark the incident in his file, but sealed it.
He rose, then turned to his window.
Perhaps that was a mistake. It's possible if I had pursued the matter at that point, he would still be alive, and we wouldn't be having this discussion.
You trusted your judgment and your man. Whitney turned back. His eyes were dark. They were intense, but not cold, Eve thought. They felt.
Yes, I did. And now I have more data. The standard autopsy on D.S. Wojcinski detected traces of digitalis and Zeus.
Zeus? Now Eve rose. Frank was not a user, Commander. Putting aside who and what he was, a chemical as powerful as Zeus shows. You see it in the eyes, in the personality shift. If he'd been using Zeus, every cop in his division would have known it. The drug scan would have picked it up. There has to be a mistake. She dug her hands into her pockets, willed herself not to pace. Yeah, there are cops who use, and there are cops who figure their badges shield them from the law, but not Frank. No way was he dirty.
But the traces were there, Lieutenant, as well as traces of other chemicals, identified as designer clones. The combination of those chemicals resulted in cardiac arrest and death.
You suspect he OD'd or self-terminated? She shook her head. That's wrong.
I repeat, the traces were there.
Then there has to be a reason. Digitalis? She frowned. That's heart medicine, isn't it? You said he'd had a physical a couple of weeks ago. Why didn't it show he had heart trouble? Whitney's gaze remained level.
Frank's closest friend on the force is the top E detective in the city.
Feeney? Eve took 2 strides forward before she could stop herself. You think Feeney covered for him? Doctored his records? Damn it, Commander!
It's a possibility I can't ignore, Whitney said evenly. Nor can you. Friendship can and does shadow judgment. I am trusting that your friendship with Feeney will not, in this case, shadow yours.
He walked to the desk, his position of authority.
These allegations and suspicions must be investigated and resolved.
The hot licks in her stomach had grown and were burning like acid. You want me to investigate fellow officers, one of which is dead, leaving a grieving family behind, the other of which was my trainer and is my friend. She put her hands on the desk. Is your friend. He'd expected the anger, accepted it, just as he expected she would do the job. He wouldn't accept less. Would you prefer I gave this to someone who didn't care? His brow lifted on the question. I want this done quietly, with each piece of evidence and all investigative records sealed for my eyes only. It may be necessary for you to speak with D.S. Wojcinski's family at some point. I trust you will do so discreetly and tactfully. There is no need to add to their grief. And if I turn something up that smears a lifetime of public service, that will be for me to deal with. She straightened. It's a hell of a thing you're asking me to do. Ordering you to do, Whitney corrected. That should make it easier, Lieutenant. On you. He handed her 2 sealed discs. View these on your home unit. Any and all transmissions on this matter are to be sent from your home unit to my home unit. Nothing is to go through Cop Central until I tell you differently. Dismissed. She turned on her heel, walked to the door. There she paused, but didn't look back. I won't roll over on Feeney. Damned if I will. Whitney watched her stride out, then closed his eyes. She would do what needed to be done, he knew. He only hoped it wasn't more than she could live with. Her temper was bubbling by the time she got back to her own office. Peabody sat in front of the monitor, smirking. Just about got it knocked. Your unit's a real whiner, Dallas, but I've been slapping it into shape. Disengage, Eve snapped, and grabbed up her jacket and bag. Get your gear, Peabody. We've got a case? Revving up, Peabody jumped out of her chair and hustled after Eve. What kind of case? Where are we going? She broke into a trot to keep up. Dallas? Lieutenant! Eve slapped the control on the elevator, and the single furious look she shot at Peabody was enough to stifle any further questions. Eve stepped into the elevator, shuffled into position with several noisy cops, and stood in stony silence. Hey, Dallas, how's the newlywed? Why don't you get your rich husband to buy the eatery and stock some real food? She flicked a steely glare over her shoulder, stared into a face of a grinning cop. Bite me, Carter. Hey, I gave that a shot 3 years ago, and you nearly broke all my teeth. She was holding out for a civilian, he said when laughter erupted. Holding out for somebody who isn't the major asshole of robbery, someone else put in. Better than being the minor one, Ferensky. Hey, Peabody, Carter continued. Want me to bite you? Is your dental plan up to date? I'll check on that and get back to you. With a wink, Carter and several others piled out. Carter puts the move on anything female, Peabody said conversationally, worried that Eve continued to stare straight ahead. Too bad he's an asshole. No response. Ferensky's kind of cute, Peabody continued. He doesn't have a steady personal partner, does he? I don't poke into the private lives of fellow officers, Eve snapped back, and strode out onto the garage level. You don't mind poking into mine, Peabody said under her breath. She waited while Eve uncoated her car locks, then climbed into the passenger seat. Am I to log in destination, sir, or is it a surprise? Then she blinked when Eve simply laid her head against the wheel. Hey, are you all right? What's going on, Dallas? Log in home office. Eve drew a breath, straightened. I'll fill you in on the way. All information you're given and all records on the ensuing investigation are to be coded and sealed. Eve maneuvered out of the garage and onto the street. All said information and records are confidential. You are to report only to me or the commander. Yes, sir. Peabody swallowed the obstruction that had lodged in her throat. It's internal, isn't it? It's one of us. Yeah, God damn it. It's one of us. Her home unit didn't have the eccentricities of her official computer. Rourke had seen to that. The data scrolled smoothly on screen. Detective Marion Burns. She's been undercover at the Athame for 8 months, working as a bartender. Eve pursed her lips. Burns. I don't know her. I do, slightly. Peabody scooted her chair a bit closer to Eve's. I met her when I was, during the Casto thing.
She struck me as a solid, eyes-on-the-job sort. If memory serves, she's third-generation cop. Her mother's still on the job, captain, I think, in Bunko. Her grandfather went out line of duty during the urban wars. I don't know why she'd have fingered D.S. Wojcinski. Maybe she reported what she saw, or maybe it's something else. We'll have to find out. Her report to Whitney's pretty cut and dried. At 130 hours, September 22nd, 2058, she observed D.S. Wojcinski seated at a private booth with known chemical dealer Selina Cross. Wojcinski exchanged credits for a small package, which appeared to contain an illegal substance. The conversation and exchange lasted 15 minutes, at which time Cross moved to another booth. Wojcinski remained in the club another 10 minutes, then left. Detective Burns tailed the subject for 2 blocks, at which time he engaged a public transport. So she never saw him use? No, and she never saw him return to the club that night or on any subsequent night during her watch. Burns goes top of our list for questioning. Yes, sir. Dallas, since Wojcinski and Feeney were tight, wouldn't it follow that Wojcinski would have confided in him, or failing that Feeney would have noticed something? I don't know. Eve rubbed her eyes. The athame. What the hell's an athame? I don't know. Peabody pulled out her Palm PC and requested the data. Athame, ceremonial knife, a ritual tool normally fashioned of steel. Traditionally, the athame is not used for cutting, but for casting or banishing circles in earth religions. Peabody glanced up at Eve. Witchcraft, she continued. That's quite a coincidence. I don't think so. She took the note from Alice out of her desk drawer, passed it to Peabody. Frank's granddaughter slipped this to me at the viewing. Turns out she works at some shop called Spirit Quest. Do you know it? I know what it is. Troubled now, Peabody set the note down. Wiccans are peaceful, Dallas, and they use herbs, not chemicals. No true Wiccan's going to buy, sell, or use Zeus. How about digitalis? Eve cocked her head. That's kind of an herb, isn't it? It's distilled from foxglove. It's been used medicinally for centuries. It's what, like a stimulant? I don't know that much about healing, but yeah, I think. So Zeus. I wonder what kind of effect you'd get combining the two. Bad mix, wrong dosage, whatever. I wouldn't be surprised if you'd get heart failure. You think Wojcinski self-terminated? The commander suspects it, and I've got questions, she said impatiently. I don't have answers, but I'm going to get them. She picked up the note. We'll start tonight, with Alice. I want you there at 11, in civilian clothes. Try to look like a free ager, Peabody, not a cop. Peabody winced. I've got this dress my mother made for my last birthday, but I'll get really pissed off if you laugh. I'll try to control myself. For now, let's see what we can dig up on this Selina Cross and the Athame Club. 5 minutes later, Eve was smiling grimly at her machine. Interesting. Our Selina's been around. Spent some time in a cage. Just look at this yellow sheet, Peabody. Soliciting sex without a license, 43, 44. Assault charge, also in 44, subsequently dropped. Ran into Bunko in 47. Running a medium scam. What the hell do people want to talk to the dead for, anyway? Suspected of animal mutilations, 49, not enough evidence for arrest. Manufacturing and distribution of illegals. That's what tagged her and put her away from 50 to 51. All small-time shit, though. But here in 55, she was brought in and questioned in connection with the ritual slaying of a minor. Her alibi held. Illegals has her under observation since she was sprung in 51, Peabody added. But they haven't brought her in. Like you said, she's small time. They must be looking for a bigger fish. That would be my take. We'll see what Marion has to say. Look here, it says Selina Cross owns the Athame Club free and clear. Eve pursed her lips. Now where'd a small-time dealer get the credit power to buy and run a club? She's a front. I wonder if illegals knows for who. Let's take a look at her. Computer, display image of subject. Cross Selina. You. Peabody gave a little shudder as the image floated on screen. Spooky.
Not a face you'd forget, Eve murmured. It was sharp and narrow, the lips full and vibrant red, the eyes black as onyx. There was beauty there, in the balance of features, the white smooth skin, but it was cold, and as Peabody had observed, spooky. Her hair was as dark as her eyes, parted perfectly in the center, and it hung straight. There was a small tattoo over her left eyebrow. What's that symbol? Eve wondered. Zoom and enhance segment 20 to 22, 30%. A pentagram. Peabody's voice quavered, causing Eve to glance over curiously. Inverted. She's not Wiccan, Dallas. Peabody cleared her throat. She's a Satanist. Eve didn't believe in such things, the white or the black of it, but she was prepared to believe others did, and more inclined to believe that some used that misguided faith to exploit. Be careful what you discount, Eve. Distracted, she glanced over. Rourke had insisted on driving. She couldn't complain, as any one of his vehicles beat the hell out of hers. What do you mean? I mean, when certain beliefs and traditions survive for centuries, there's a reason for it. Sure there is. Human beings are, and always have been, gullible. And there are and always have been individuals who know how to exploit that gullibility. I'm going to find out if someone exploited Frank's. She had told Rourke everything, and had justified it professionally by telling herself since she couldn't tap Feeney for his computer expertise, she could and would tap Rourke for his. You're a good cop, and a sensible woman. Often you're too good a cop and too sensible a woman. He stopped for traffic, turned to her. I'm asking you to be particularly careful when delving into an area such as this. His face was in shadows, and his voice much too serious. You mean witches and devil worshippers? Come on, Rourke. We're into the second millennium here. Satanists, for Christ's sake? She pushed her hair back from her face. What the hell do they think they'd do with him if he existed and they managed to get his attention? That's the problem, isn't it? Rourke said quietly, and turned west toward the Aquarian Club. Devils exist. Eve frowned as he slid his vehicle up to the second-level spot on the street. And they're flesh and blood. They walk on two legs. You and I have seen plenty of them. She got out, took the ramp down to street level. It was breezy, and the freshening wind had cleared the smells and smoke away. Overhead, the sky was a thick black, unrelieved by moon or stars. Crisscrossing beams from sluggish air traffic flickered, chased by the muffled grumble of engines. Here on the street was an arty, upmarket part of town, where even the Glidagrill on the corner was spotless, and its menu ran to fresh hybrid fruit rather than smoky soy dogs. Most of the street vendors had closed up for the night, but during the day they would unfold their carts and discreetly hawk offerings of handmade jewelry, hooked rugs and tapestries, herbal baths and teas. Panhandlers in this area would likely be polite, their licenses clearly displayed, and they would probably spend their daily earnings on a meal rather than a chemical high. The crime rate was low, the rents murderous, and the median age of its residents and merchants carelessly young. She would have hated to live there. We're early, she murmured, scanning the street as a matter of habit. Then her mouth curved into a smirk. Look at that, will you? The Psychic Deli. I guess you go in, order the veggie hash, and they claim they knew you were going to do that. Pasta salad and palm readings. They're open. On impulse, she turned to Rourke. She wanted something that would turn her sour mood. You game? You want your palm read? What the hell? She grabbed his hand. It'll put me in the groove for investigating satanic chemi dealers. Maybe they'll cut us a deal and do yours for half price. No. You never know unless you ask. I'm not having mine read. Coward, she muttered, and tugged him through the door. I prefer the word careful. She had to admit, it smelled wonderful. There was none of the usual overlay of onion and heavy sauces. Instead, there was a light fragrance of spice and flowers that meshed perfectly with the airy music. Small white tables and chairs were arranged at a nice distance from the display counter, where bowls and plates of colorful food were presented behind sparkling glass. Two customers sat together over bowls of clear soup. Both of them sported flowing white robes, jeweled sandals, and shaved heads. Behind the counter was a man with silver rings on every finger. He wore a wide-sleeved shirt in quiet blue. His blonde hair was neatly braided and twined with silver cord. He smiled in welcome. "Blessed be. Do you wish food for the body or for the soul?" "I thought you were supposed to know," Eve grinned at him. "How about a reading? Palm, tarot, runes, or aura?" "Palm." Enjoying herself, Eve stuck her hand out. "Cassandra is our palmist. If you'll take a comfortable seat, she'll be happy to help you. Sister," he added as she started to turn, "your auras are very strong, vibrant. You are well matched." With this, he picked up a wooden stick with a rounded edge and ran it gently over the rim of a white frosted bowl. Even as the vibration sang, a woman stepped through the beaded curtain separating a back room. She wore a silver tunic with a silver bracelet coiled above her elbow. Eve noted that she was very young, barely 20, and like the man, her hair was blonde and coiled into a braid. "Welcome." Her voice held a hint of Ireland. "Please be comfortable. Would you both like a reading?" "No, just me." Eve took a seat at a far table. "What's it run?" "The reading is free. We request a donation only." She sat gracefully, smiled at Rourke. "Your generosity will be appreciated. Madam, the hand you were born with?" "I came with both of them." "The left, please." She cupped her fingers under Eve's offered hand, barely touching at first. "Strength and courage. Your fate was not set. A trauma, a break in the lifeline. Very young, you were only a child. Such pain, such sadness." She lifted her gaze, clear gray. "You were, and are, without blame." She tightened her grip when Eve instinctively drew back. "It's not necessary to remember all until you're ready. Sorrow and self-doubt, passions blocked. A solitary woman who chose to focus on one goal, a great need for justice. Disciplined, self-motivated, troubled. Your heart was broken. More than broken, mauled, so you guarded what was left. It's a capable hand, one to trust." She took Eve's right hand firmly, but barely looked at it. Those clear gray eyes stayed on Eve's face. "You carry much of what was inside you. It will not be quiet. It will not rest. But you found your place. Authority suits you, as does the responsibility that marches with it. You're stubborn, often single-focused, but your heart is greatly healed. You love." She flicked a glance at Rourke again, and her mouth softened when she looked back at Eve. "It surprises you, the depth of this. It unnerves you, and you are not easily unnerved." Her thumb skimmed over the top of Eve's palm. "Your heart runs deep. It is choosy. It is careful. But when it's given, it's complete. You carry identification." "A badge?" She smiled slowly. "Yes, you have made the right choice. Perhaps the only one you could have made. You've killed, more than once. There was no alternative for you, yet this weighs heavy on your mind and heart. In this you find it difficult to separate the intellect from the emotion. You'll kill again." The gray eyes went glassy, and the light grip tightened. "It's dark. The forces are dark here. Evil. Lives already lost and others yet to lose. Pain and fear. Body and soul. You must protect yourself and those you love." She turned to Rourke, snagging his hand and speaking rapidly in Gaelic. Her face had gone very white, and her breath hitched. "That's enough." Shaken, Eve snatched her hand back. Hell of a show. Irritated that her palm tingled, she rubbed it hard against the knee of her slacks. "You've got a good eye, Cassandra, is it? And an impressive spiel." She dug into her pocket, took out 15 credits, and laid them on the table. "Wait." Cassandra opened a small embroidered pouch at her waist, plucked out a smooth stone in pale green. "A gift, a token." She pushed it into Eve's hand. "Carry it with you."
"Why?"
"Why not? Please come again. Blessed be."
Eve caught one last glance at her pale face before Cassandra hurried into the back room with a musical jingle of beads. "Well, so much for you're taking a long ocean voyage," Eve muttered as she headed for the door. "What did she say to you?" "Her dialect was a bit thick. I'd say she's from the West Counties." He stepped outside, oddly relieved to draw in the night air. "The gist was that if I loved you as much as she believed, I would stay close, that you're in danger of losing your life, perhaps your soul, and you need me to survive it." "What a crock!" She glanced down at the stone in her hand. "Keep it." Rourke closed her fingers over it. "Couldn't hurt." With a shrug, Eve pushed it into her pocket. "I think I'm going to steer clear of psychics." "An excellent idea," Rourke said with feeling as he walked with her across the street and into the Aquarian Club. Chapter 3. It was a quiet place, Eve mused, and certainly quieter than any club she'd been in before. Both conversation and music were muted, and both had an elegant little lilt. Tables were packed together, as was the norm, but they were arranged to provide circular traffic patterns that reminded Eve of the symbol at the base of Alice's note. Ringing the walls were mirrors fashioned into the shapes of stars and moons. Each held a burning candle, a white pillar that reflected light and flame. Between each mirror were plaques of symbols and figures she didn't recognize. The small dance floor was circular as well, as was the bar where patrons sat on stools that depicted signs of the zodiac. It took her a moment to place the woman seated on the twin faces of Gemini. "Jesus, that's Peabody!" Rourke shifted his gaze, focused on the woman in a long, sweeping dress in swirling hues of blue and green. 3 long strands of beads sparkled to her waist, and earrings of varicolored metals jingled beneath the fringes of her straight, cropped hair. "Well, well," he said, and smiled slowly. "Our sturdy Peabody makes quite a picture." "She sure blends," Eve decided. "I have to meet with Alice alone. Why don't you go over and talk to Peabody?" "A pleasure." "Lieutenant." He took a long look at her worn jeans, battered leather jacket, and unadorned ears. "You don't blend." "Is that a dig?" "No." He flicked a finger over the dent in her chin. "An observation." He strolled over, slid onto the stool beside Peabody. "Now, let's see. What would be the standard line? What's a nice witch like you doing in a place like this?" Peabody slid him a sidelong look, grimaced. "I feel like an idiot in this get-up." "You look lovely." She snorted. "Not exactly my style." "You know, the fascinating thing about women, Peabody." He reached out, tapped a finger against her dangling earrings to send them dancing. "You have so many styles. What are you drinking?" Ridiculously flattered, she struggled not to flush. "Oh, Sagittarius. That's my sign. The drink's supposed to be metabolically and spiritually designed for my personality." She sipped from the clear chalice. "Actually, it's not bad. What's your, birth sign?" "I have no idea. I believe I was born the first week of October." "Believe?" Peabody mused. "How odd not to know." "Well, that would make you Libran." "Well, then, let's be metabolically and spiritually correct." He turned to order drinks, watched Eve sitting at a table. "What sign would you attribute to your lieutenant?" "She's a tough one to pin down." "Indeed she is," Rourke murmured. From her table on the outer circle, Eve watched everything. There was no band or holographic image of one. Instead, the music seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Windy flutes and plucked strings, a soothing female voice that sang with impossible sweetness in a language Eve didn't recognize. She saw couples in earnest conversations, others laughing quietly. No one flickered an eyelash when a woman in a sheer white sheath rose to dance alone. Eve ordered water and was amused when it was served in a goblet of simulated silver. She tuned into the conversation at the table behind her and was further amused to hear the group's sober discussion on their experiences with astral projection. At a table in the next ring, two women talked about their former lives as temple dancers in Atlantis. She wondered why former lives were always more exotic than the one being lived. The only shot a person had, in her opinion. Harmless weirdos, Eve thought, but caught herself rubbing her still tingling palm on her jeans. She saw Alice the minute the girl walked in. Agitated, Eve thought. Nervous hands, tensed shoulders, jittery eyes. She waited until Alice scanned the room, spotted her, then she inclined her head in acknowledgement. With a last backward glance at the door, Alice hurried over. "You came. I was afraid you wouldn't." Quickly, she dipped into her pocket and drew out a smooth black stone on a silver chain. "Put this on, please," she insisted, when Eve only studied it. "It's obsidian. It's been consecrated. It'll block evil." "I'm all for that." Eve slipped the chain around her neck. "Better?" "This is the safest place I know. The cleanest." Still darting glances around them, Alice sat. "I used to come here all the time." She gripped the amulet she wore in both hands as a server glided to the table. "A golden sun, please." She took a deep breath as she looked back at Eve. "I need courage. I've tried to meditate all day, but I'm blocked. I'm afraid." "What are you afraid of, Alice?" "That those who killed my grandfather will kill me next." "Who killed your grandfather?" "Evil killed him. Killing is what evil does best. You won't believe what I tell you. You're too grounded in what can be seen only with the eyes. You are too much of a cop." "I don't want to die," Alice said, and set her cup down. That, Eve thought, was the first sensible statement she'd heard. The fear was genuine enough, she decided, and unmasked tonight. At the viewing, Alice had been careful to slick on a layer of composure and calm. For her family, Eve realized. "Who are you afraid of, and why?" "I have to explain. All of it. I have to purge before I can atone. My grandfather respected you, so I come to you in his memory. I wasn't born a witch." "Weren't you?" Eve said dryly. "Some are, and some, like me, are simply drawn to the craft. I became interested in Wicca through my studies, and the more I learned, the more I felt a need to belong. I was drawn to the rituals, the search for balance, the joy, and the positive ethics. I didn't share my interest with my family. They wouldn't have understood." She dipped her head, and her hair flowed down like a curtain. "I enjoyed the secrecy of that, and was still young enough to find the experience of going sky-clad at an outdoor celebration slightly wicked. My family," she lifted her head again, "they're conservative, and a part of me simply wanted to do something daring." "A small rebellion?" "Yes, that's true. If I had left it at that," Alice murmured. "If I had truly accepted my initiation into the craft and what it meant, everything would be different now. I was weak, and my intellect too ambitious." She picked up her drink again, wet her dry throat. "I wanted to know, to compare and analyze, rather like a thesis, the contrasts of white and black magic. How could I fully appreciate the one without fully understanding its antithesis? That was my rationale." "Sounds logical." "False logic," Alice insisted. "I was deluding myself. The ego and the intellect were so arrogant. I would study the black arts on a purely scholarly level. I'd talk to those who had chosen the other path and discover what had turned them away from the light. It would be exciting." She smiled tremulously. "I thought it would be exciting, and for a short time it was." A child, Eve thought, in the body of a stunning woman. Bright and curious, but a child nonetheless. It was pitifully easy to tug information from the young. "Is that how you met Selina Cross?" Paling, Alice made a quick forking gesture with her forefinger and pinky. "How do you know of her?" "I did some research. I didn't walk in here blind, Alice. As a cop's granddaughter, you shouldn't have expected me to." "Be afraid of her." Alice compressed her lips. "Be afraid of her. She's a second-rate grifter and chemi dealer." "No, she's much more." Alice gripped her amulet again.
Believe that, Lieutenant. I've seen, I know. She'll want you. You'll challenge her.
Do you believe she had something to do with Frank's death?
I know she did. Tears swam into her eyes, deepening the soft blue. One huge and lovely drop spilled over and slid down her white cheek. Because of me.
Eve leaned closer to comfort and to block the tearful face from any onlookers. Tell me about it. About her.
I met her nearly a year ago, on the Sabbat of Samhain, All Hallows' Eve. More research, I told myself. I didn't realize how deeply I'd already been drawn in, how utterly seduced I was by the power, the pure, selfish greed of the other side. I hadn't performed any of the rituals, not then. I was still observing. Then I met her, and the one they call Alban. Alban? He serves her.
Alice lifted a hand, laid her fingers against her mouth.
That night still isn't clear in my mind. I realize now they cast a spell over me. I let them lead me into the circle, strip off my robes. I heard the bells ring and the chant to the Dark Prince. I watched the sacrifice of the goat, and I shared in the blood.
Her head drooped again as shame whirled inside her.
I shared in it, drank of it, and enjoyed. I was the altar that night. I was tied to the stone. I don't know how or by whom, but I wasn't afraid. I was aroused.
Her voice dropped to a whisper. The music changed, slid from strings to drums and bells, cheerfully sexual. Alice never lifted her gaze.
Each member of the coven touched me, rubbed oils and blood over me. The chanting was inside me, and the fire was so hot. Then Selina laid over me. She did things. I'd never had any sexual experience. Then, while she slid up my body, Alban straddled me. She watched me. His hands were on her breasts, and he was inside me, and she watched my face. I wanted to close my eyes, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop looking into her eyes. It was like she was the one inside me.
Her tears plopped on the table now. Even though Eve had shifted to shield her from most of the room, and Alice's voice was barely more than a whisper, several heads were turning curiously. You were drugged, Alice, and exploited. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Her eyes lifted briefly and threatened to break Eve's heart.
Then why am I so ashamed? I was a virgin, and there was pain, but even that was arousing, unbearably. And the pleasure that came with it was huge, monstrous. They used me, and I begged to be used again, and I was, by the entire coven. By sunrise I was lost, enslaved. I woke in bed, between them, Alban and Selina. I'd already become their apprentice, and their toy.
Tears were running down her cheeks as she drank again.
Sexually, there was nothing I would not allow them, or one of their choosing, to do to me. I embraced the dark, and I became careless in my arrogance. Someone told my grandfather. He would never give me a name, but I know it was a Wiccan. He confronted me, and I laughed at him. I warned him to stay out of my affairs. I thought he had.
Saying nothing, Eve slid her water across the table. Gratefully, Alice picked it up, drained it.
A few months ago, I discovered Selina and Alban were performing private rituals. I'd come down from college a day early. I went to their house, and I heard the ceremonial chant. I opened the door of the ritual room. They were there, together, performing a sacrifice.
Her hand shook.
Not a goat this time, but a child, a young boy.
Eve's hand closed tight over Alice's wrist. You saw them murder a child?
Murder is too tame a word for what they did.
The tears dried up in horror.
Don't ask me to tell you. Don't ask me that.
She would have to, Eve knew, but it could wait. Tell me what you can.
I saw Selina, the ritual knife, the blood, the screams. I swear you could see the screams like black smears on the air. It was too late to stop it. She looked at Eve again, those swimming eyes begging to be believed in this one thing. I was too late to do anything for the boy, even if I'd had the power or the courage to try. You were alone, shocked, Eve said carefully. The woman was armed. The boy was dead. You couldn't have helped him. For one long moment, Alice stared at her, then covered her face with her hands. I tried to believe that. Try so hard. Living with it is destroying me. I ran away. I just ran. You can't change it. Eve kept her hand on Alice's wrist, but her grip gentled. She had once seen a child mutilated, had been too late, seconds too late. She hadn't run. She had killed, but the child was just as dead either way. You can't go back and change it. You have to live with what is. I know. Isis tells me that. Alice took a shuddering breath, lowered her hands. They were engrossed in their work and never saw me, or I pray they never saw me. I did it to my grandfather or the police. I was terrified, sick. I don't know how much time went by, but I went to Isis, the high priestess who had initiated me into Wicca. She took me in. Even after all I'd done, she took me in. You didn't tell Frank what you'd seen. Alice winced at the bite in Eve's voice. Not then. I spent time in reflection and purification. Isis performed several cleansing rites and auric healings. Isis and I felt it best that I stay in seclusion for a while, concentrate on finding the light and atonement. Eve's eyes were hot and hard as she leaned closer. Alice, you saw a child murdered and told no one but your neighborhood witch? I know how it sounds. Her lip quivered before she caught it between her teeth and steadied it. The child's physical being was beyond passage. I could do nothing for him but pray for the safe passage of his soul to the next plane. I was afraid to tell Grandpa, afraid of what he might do and what Selina would do to him. When I did go to him last month, I told him everything. Now he's dead, and I know she's responsible. How do you know? I saw her. Wait. Eyes narrowed, Eve held up a hand. You saw her kill him? No, I saw her outside my window. I looked out the night he died, and she was standing below, looking up at me. The call came from my mother to tell me Grandpa was dead, and Selina smiled. She smiled, and she beckoned to me. Alice buried her face in her hands again. She sent her forces against him, used her power to stop his heart, because of me. Now the raven comes every night to my window and watches me with her eyes. Christ, Eve thought, where were they going with this? A bird? Alice laid her trembling hands on the table. She's a shape-shifter. She takes what form she wills. I've protected myself as best I can, but my faith may not be strong enough. They're pulling at me, calling to me. Alice. While sympathy remained, Eve found her patience waning. Selina Cross might have had a part in your grandfather's death. If we find that he didn't die of natural causes, it wasn't some spell. It was calculated, simple murder. If so, there'll be evidence and a trial, and she'll be dealt with. You can't find smoke. Alice shook her head. You won't find evidence in a curse. Enough was enough. At this point, you're a witness to a crime, potentially the only witness, and if you're afraid, I can arrange a safe house for you. Her voice was flat and brisk, all cop. I need you to give me a description of the child so I can check missing persons. With your formal statement, I can get a warrant to search the room where you allegedly witnessed the murder. I need you to give me details, straight details, times, places, names. I can help you. You don't understand, Alice said, shaking her head slowly. You don't believe me. I believe you're an intelligent and curious woman who got in over her head with some very nasty people. And I believe you're confused and upset. I have someone you can talk to who can help you sort things out. Someone? Alice's eyes went cold and her voice hard. A psychiatrist? You think I'm imagining things, making them up. Her body trembled as she surged to her feet. It's not my mind that's in danger, it's my life. My life, Lieutenant Dallas, and my soul. If you find yourself in battle with Selina, you'll believe, and may the goddess help you." She whirled and ran out, leaving Eve cursing. "That seemed remarkably unsuccessful," Rourke commented as he came up behind her. "The girl's whacked out, but she's terrified." Eve heaved a long breath and rose. "Let's get the hell out of here." She signaled Peabody, then headed for the door. Outside, a thin fog crept along the ground, stealthily, like twining gray snakes. Rain, thin and chilly, was just beginning to slick the street. "There she is," Eve murmured, when she caught sight of Alice rushing around the corner. "Headed south. Peabody Taylor. Make sure she gets home safe." "Got her." Peabody headed off at a half-trot. "That kid's a mess, Rourke. They've fucked with her in every way possible." Disgusted, she dug her hands into her pockets. "I probably could have handled it better, but I don't see how it would help to encourage her delusions. Spells and curses and shape-shifters? Jesus." "Darling Eve," he kissed her brow, "my own practical cop." The way she tells it, she was practically the bride of Satan. Grumbling, Eve started for the car, turned on her heel, and paced back. "I'll tell you how it went, Rourke. She wanted to play, wanted to dabble in the occult, and she ran into real bad news. She's a naive, pretty girl, and it doesn't take a crystal ball to see it. So she went to one of their meetings, or whatever the hell you call them, and they drugged her. Then they gang-raped her. Bastards. She's drugged and in shock and vulnerable to suggestions, and it's easy for a couple of professional cons to convince her she's part of their cult. Pull a couple of magic tricks out of their hat and fascinate her. Use sex to keep her in line." "She got to you," Rourke murmured, and touched her hair, brushing away the wet. "Maybe she did." "Damn it, did you look at her? She's well named. Looks like that kid in the fairy story. Probably believes in talking rabbits, too." Then she sighed, struggled to put her emotions back into place. "But we're not in a fairy story here. She claims she walked in on a ritual murder. A little boy," she said. "I've got to get her into Mira. A shrink will be able to sort out the fact from fiction, but I believe that murder was fact, and if they killed one child, they've killed more. People like them prey on the helpless." "I know." He reached out to rub the tension in her shoulders. "Close to home? No, it's not like what happened to me. Or you. But there were enough echoes to unnerve her. We're still here, aren't we?" She laid a hand on his, but frowned into the shadows. Why didn't Frank make a log of what she'd told him? Why the hell did he go solo on this one? Maybe he did make a log. A private one. She blinked, stared at him. God, how could I be so slow? She clapped her hands on either side of his face and kissed him hard. "You're brilliant." "Yes, I know." He jerked her back as a figure darted out of the shadows and over the ramp. "Black cat," he said, simultaneously uneasy and amused at himself. "Bad luck?" "Yeah, right." She started up the ramp, cocked her head as the cat sat on the side of Rourke's car, watching her out of bright and glittering green eyes. "You don't look hungry, Ace. Too sleek and glossy for an alley cat." Too perfect, she realized. Must be a droid. Still she crouched, reached out to stroke. The cat hissed, arched, and swiped. Eve would have found her palm laid open if she hadn't been quick enough to dodge. Well, that's friendly. You should know better than to offer your hand to strange animals, or droids. But he stepped in front of Eve to uncode the car and kept his eyes on the gleaming green of the cat's. When Eve was in the car, he spoke softly. The cat's fur bristled, its tail switched. Then it leaped nimbly from the ramp to the street, and it was swallowed by the fog. Rourke couldn't have said why he'd given the order to go in Gaelic. It had simply come out that way. He was still pondering it when he slid in beside Eve. "Listen, Rourke, I can't tap Feeney for any E-work on this. At least not until the commander loosens up. I may have to go to the family for access to Frank's personal records, but if I do that, I'll have to tell them something. And you'd rather not. Not yet, in any case. So how do you feel about using your skills to access Frank's personal unit and logs. His mood lifted as he started the car, gliding it down to street level. "That depends, Lieutenant. Do I get a badge?" Her lips twitched into a smirk. "No, but you get to have sex with a cop." "Do I get to pick the cop?" He only smiled when she punched his arm. "I'd pick you." "Probably. And I suppose you want me to begin my unofficial consultation tonight." "That's the idea." "All right, but I want sex first." He tucked his tongue into his cheek as she chuckled. "How long do you think Peabody's going to be busy?" "Just joking," he said quickly, but shifted into auto drive just in case Eve got violent. She did look quite appealing tonight, though. Laughing, he caught her fist in his hand, then snuck the other one up to her breast. "Listen, pal, you're in deep enough without trying that. Engaging in any sexual act in a moving vehicle is in violation of inner-city codes." "Arrest me," he suggested, and nipped her bottom lip. "All right. When I'm done with you." She wiggled free and shoved him back. "And just for that smart-ass remark about my no sex until after the consult." He disengaged Otto, then slid her a slow, smiling glance. "Wanna bet?" She met that arrogant glance, narrow-eyed. 50 credits, even odds. Done. And he whistled his way through the iron gates that led home. Chapter 4. Pay up. Eve rolled over, rubbed her bare butt, and wondered if she'd have rug burns. Still vibrating from the last orgasm, she closed her eyes again. "Huh?" 50 credits. He leaned over, gently kissed the tip of her breast. "You lost, Lieutenant." Her eyes blinked open and stared into his gorgeous and very satisfied face. They were sprawled on the rug of his private room, and their clothes, as best she could recall, were scattered everywhere, starting at the stairway, where he'd trapped her against the wall and had started to win the bet. "I'm naked," she pointed out. "I don't generally keep credits up my— I'm happy to take your IOU." He rose, all graceful, gleaming muscles, and took a memo card from his console. "Here you are," handed it to her. She stared down at it, knowing dignity was as lost as the 50 credits. "You're really enjoying this." "Oh, more than you can possibly imagine." Scowling at him, she engaged the memo. "IOU Rourke, 50 credits. Dallas, Lieutenant Eve." She shoved the memo at him. "Satisfied?" "In every possible way." He thought sentimentally that he would tuck the memo away with the little gray suit button he'd kept from their very first meeting. "I love you, Dallas, Lieutenant Eve, in every possible way." She couldn't help it. She went soft all over. It was the way he said it, the way he looked at her, that had rapid pulses beating under melting skin. "Oh, no, you don't. That kind of thing's how you took me for 50. She scrambled up before he could distract her again. "Where the hell are my pants?" "I haven't the faintest idea." He walked to a section of the wall, touched a mechanism. When the panel slid open, he drew out a robe. It was silk and thin and made her eyes narrow again. He was always buying her things like that, and they always seemed to find their way to various parts of the house, conveniently. "That's not working attire." "We can do this naked, but you'd certainly lose another 50. When she snatched the robe out of his hand, he turned and took out another for himself. "This could take some time. We'll want coffee." As she went to the auto chef to get coffee, Rourke moved behind the console. The equipment here was first flight and unregistered. CompuGuard couldn't track it nor block him from hacking into any system. Still, even with those advantages, finding a personal log that may or may not have existed was like separating individual grains of sand from a bucketful. "Engage," he ordered. More likely his home unit, wouldn't you think? Anything on his unit at Cop Central would have been transferred, and official units record all logging. If he wanted to keep something to himself, he'd have used a private system. "Do you have his home address?" "Never mind," he said before Eve could speak. "I'll get it. Data, Wojcinski, Frank, what was his rank?" "Detective Sergeant, attached to records." "Data on screen 1, please." As it began to scroll, Rourke reached for the coffee Eve held out to him, then waved his fingers when his link beeped. "Get that, would you?" It was the careless order of a man used to giving them. Automatically she bristled, then just as quickly bumped aside her annoyance. She supposed the situation called for her to act as assistant. "Rourke's residence?" "Peabody? You didn't answer your communicator." "No, God knew where it was," she thought. "What's up?" "It's bad, Dallas. It's bad." Though her voice was steady, her face was dead white, and her eyes too dark. "Alice is dead. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't get to her. She just— Where are you?" "On 10th Street, between Broad and 7th. I called the MTS, but there was nothing—" "Are you in jeopardy?" No. I just couldn't stop her. I just watched while—" "Secure the scene, officer. Relay to dispatch. I'm on my way. Call backup as required and stand. Understood?" "Yes, sir. Yes." "Dallas out." "Oh, Christ," she murmured when she disengaged. "I'll take you." He was already up, his hand on her shoulder. "No, it's my job," and she prayed it wasn't her doing. "I'd appreciate it if you'd stay here and get whatever data you can." "All right, Eve." He took both of her shoulders now, firmly, before she could turn away. "Look at me. This was not your fault." She did look at him, and there was grief in her eyes. "I hope to God it wasn't." There wasn't a crowd. Eve could be grateful for that. It was after 2 a.m, and only a few gawkers huddled together behind the barricade. She saw a rapid cab, tipped drunkenly on the curb, and a man sitting beside it, his head in his hands, as an MT spoke with him. On the rain-slicked street, lit dimly by the glow of a security light with fog billowing like clouds, was Alice. Her body sprawled there, face up, her arms and legs flung out as if in wild welcome. Blood, her own, had soaked through the filmy material of her dress and turned it to dark, doomed red. Peabody stood by her, assisting uniform in the erecting of a privacy screen. "Officer Peabody," Eve said it softly, waited for Peabody to turn, straighten her shoulders, and cross to her. "Your report?" "I followed the subject to her residence, as per your orders, Lieutenant. I watched her enter the building and subsequently observed the light go on in the second window from the east, 3rd floor. On my own initiative, I decided to keep watch for a period of 15 minutes to ensure the subject remained inside. She did not." Peabody trailed off, and her gaze shifted to the body. Eve sidestepped, blocked the view. "Look at me when you report, officer." "Yes, sir," Peabody snapped back. "Subject exited building approximately 10 minutes later. She appeared agitated, continually looked over her shoulder as she walked west at a rapid pace. She appeared to be crying. I maintained the standard distance. That's why I couldn't stop her." Peabody had to suck in air. "I maintained the standard distance. Stop it." Eve snapped it out, gave Peabody a quick shake. "Complete your report." Peabody's eyes went flat and cold as they met Eve's. "Yes, sir." The subject stopped suddenly, took several steps in retreat. She spoke. I was too far away to discern what she said, but it was my impression that she was speaking to someone. She played it back through her mind, every step, leaning on her training like a crutch. "I closed the distance somewhat, in the event the subject was in jeopardy. I observed no one on the street other than the subject herself. The fog may have been a factor, but there was no one on the sidewalk or the street that I could see." "She stood there, talking to no one?" Eve asked. "That's how it appeared, Lieutenant. She became increasingly agitated. She begged to be left alone. Her words were, 'Haven't you done enough? Haven't you taken enough? Why won't you leave me in peace?'" Peabody stared back at the sidewalk, saw it all again, heard it as well, that hitch of desperation and despair in Alice's voice. "I thought I heard a response, but can't be definite. The subject was speaking too loudly and too rapidly for me to make a clear statement on that. I decided to move closer to make myself known." A muscle in her jaw jumped as she continued to stare over Eve's shoulder. "At this time, a rapid cab, traveling east, approached. The subject turned and ran into the street, directly into the path of the oncoming vehicle.
The driver attempted to stop and evade, but was unable to do so and struck the subject head-on. She paused just long enough to take another breath. Road conditions were fair to poor and played a minor factor. Even with optimum conditions, it would be my opinion the driver would have been unable to avoid the collision. Understood. Continue. I reached the body within seconds, and though I observed that she was already dead, I called for the medical technicians, then attempted to contact you via your communicator. When this was unsuccessful, I utilized the portal-link in my bag and reached you at home to report the situation. Following your orders, I relayed to dispatch and requested a uniform, then secured the scene. It was hell to be too late, Eve knew, and no amount of sympathy could ease that bitter guilt. So she offered none. Very well, officer. That's the driver? Peabody continued to stare straight ahead, and her voice was hollow. Yes, Lieutenant. Arrange for his vehicle to be taken in for analysis, then consult with the MTs and find out if he's in shape to give a statement. Yes, sir. Peabody clutched her hand into a fist at her side. She kept her voice low, but it vibrated with emotion. You had a drink with her barely an hour ago, and it doesn't mean a damn to you. Eve took the hit and waited until Peabody turned away, before she walked back to Alice. Yes, it does, she murmured. And that's the problem. Opening her field kit, she crouched down to do her job. It wasn't homicide. Technically, Eve should have turned the matter over to traffic after Peabody's report and the ensuing statement from the weeping cabbie. But she watched Alice's body being loaded into the morgue wagon and knew she had no intention of doing so. She took a last look at the scene. The rain had nearly stopped and wouldn't wash away the blood. The few gawkers who had gathered were already breaking up and moving along, tearing the last thin curtains of fog as they shuffled home. Across at the curb, a city tow unit was already hitching up the damaged cab for transferal to the police compound. Accidents, some would say, happened all too often, and so, Eve thought, did murder. All too often. You've had a long night, Peabody. You're off duty. I would prefer to stay on, Lieutenant, and see this through. You won't help her or me unless you can see it through objectively. I can do my job, sir. My feelings are my own business. Eve hitched up her field kit, took a long look at her aide. Yes, they are. Just don't let them get in my way. She took her recorder out of her kit, held it out to Peabody. On record, officer. We'll examine the subject's residence. Do you intend to notify the next of kin, sir? When we're done here. They headed east, back to Alice's building. She hadn't gotten far, Eve thought, barely a block. What had driven her back out? And what had driven her into the path of the cab? The building was a pretty, restored brownstone of 3 stories. The entrance doors sported beveled glass with an etched design of peacocks. The security camera was in full repair, and the locks coded for palm prints. Eve disarmed them with a master code and entered a small, well-scrubbed foyer with faux marble floors. The elevator had a mirrored bronze sheen and ran with silent efficiency. Alice, she thought, had had taste and the financial resources to indulge it. There were 3 apartments on the 3rd floor, and again Eve used her master to gain entrance. Dallas, Lieutenant Eve, and aide Peabody, Officer D, entering residence of deceased for standard examination. Lights, she ordered, then frowned when the room remained dark. Peabody reached around the door, flicked a switch. She must have preferred manual to voice-activated. The room was cluttered and colorful. Pretty scarves and throws were draped over chairs, tables. Tapestries depicting attractive naked people and mythological animals romped over the walls. Candles were everywhere, on tables, on shelves, on the floor, as were bowls of colored stones, of herbs, of dried flower petals. Chunks and wands of crystal, sparkling clean, crowded every flat surface. A mood screen was engaged and showed a wide field of meadow grass and wildflowers blowing gently in the breeze. Its audio played the song of birds and zephyrs. She liked pretty things, Eve observed, and lots of them. Moving over, she glanced at the controls of the mood screen and nodded as they corroborated her thought. She flipped this on as soon as she walked in.
Wanted to mellow out, I'd say. Leaving Peabody to follow, she walked into the adjoining room. The bedroom was small, cozy, and again cluttered. The spread on the narrow bed was embroidered with stars and moons. A glass mobile, dancing with fairies, hung above it and even now clinked musically in the breeze through the open window. This would have been the window, the light you saw come on. Yes, sir. So she flipped on the screen, then came straight into the bedroom. Probably wanted to change, get out of the damp dress. But she didn't. Eve stepped onto a small area rug with the face of a smiling sun. It's cluttered, but tidy in its way. No sign of disturbance or struggle. Struggle? You said she was agitated, crying when she came back out. The Country Meadow program didn't mellow her, or didn't have enough time to. She didn't bother to shut it down again. No, Eve agreed, she didn't. There's the possibility someone was here when she got home. Someone who upset or frightened her. We'll check the security logs. She opened what she assumed was a closet and let out a hum. Well, look at this. She's turned it into a room of some kind. Not a lot of clutter here. Get this on record. Peabody stepped up, scanned the recorder over a small white-walled room. The floor was wood, with a white pentagram painted on it. A ring of white candles were arranged in careful symmetry around the edge. A small table held a clear crystal ball, a bowl, a mirror, and a dark-handled knife with a short, blunted blade. Eve sniffed the air, but caught no hint of smoke or candle wax. What do you figure she did in here? I'd say it was kind of a ritual room, for meditation or casting spells. Jesus. With a shake of her head, Eve stepped back. We'll leave that for now and check out her link. If no one was here to scare her back out, maybe she got a call that did. She came into the bedroom first, Eve murmured, wandering back to the small bedside link. Maybe she intended to go in there and play witch after she'd changed and calmed down. She wasn't carrying anything when she went back out. She didn't come in here to get something and go out again. She was upset. She came home. Eve engaged the link, requested a replay of the last call transmitted or received, and the room filled with low, rhythmic chanting. What the hell is that? I don't know. Uneasy, Peabody stepped closer. Replay, Eve demanded. Hear the names and fear them. Loki, Beelzebub, Baphomet, I am annihilation, I am revenge. In nomine Dei nostri Satanas Luciferi excelsi, vengeance for you who strayed from the law, hear the names and fear. Stop! Eve gave a quick involuntary shudder. Beelzebub, that's devil shit, isn't it? The bastards were playing with her, tormenting her, and she was already on the edge. No wonder she ran out of here. Where were you, you son of a bitch? Where were you? Location of last transmission. Display. Her mouth thinned as she read the data. 10th and 7th, right down the goddamn street. Probably a public link. Fuckers. She was heading right for them. There wasn't anyone there. But Peabody was watching Eve's face now, and the fury that fired in her eyes. Even with the fog, the rain, I would have seen someone if they'd been laying for her. There wasn't anything there but a cat. Eve's heart took a bad jump. A what? Just a cat. I caught a glimpse of a cat, but there was no one on the street. A cat. Eve walked to the window. Suddenly she felt the need for a good gulp of air. There, on the sill, she saw the long black feather. And a bird, she murmured. She took out tweezers, held the feather up to the light. We've still got the occasional crow in New York. A crow's the same thing as a raven, isn't it? More or less, I think. Bag it, Eve ordered. I want it analyzed. She rubbed her fingers over her eyes as if to push away fatigue. Next of kin would be Brenda Wojcinski, mother. Run that for an address. Yes, sir. Peabody took out her PPC, then simply held it while shame washed over her. Lieutenant, I'd like to apologize for my earlier comment and my behavior. Eve took the disk from the link, sealed it herself. I don't recall any comment, Peabody, or any unsatisfactory behavior. She gave Peabody a level look. While the recorder is still engaged, do another scan of the apartment. Understanding, Peabody inclined her head. I'm aware the recorder is still engaged, Lieutenant. I want this on the record. I was insubordinate and out of line, both professionally and personally. Damn stiff-necked idiot, Eve thought, and bit back an oath. There was no insubordination in my opinion or in my recollection, officer. Dallas. Peabody loosed a sigh. I damn well was. I was shaky and having a hard time dealing with the situation. It's one thing to see a body after it's done, and another to see a woman get tossed 10 feet in the air and land on the pavement. She was under my watch. I was rough on you. Yes, sir, you were, and you needed to be. I thought that because you were able to maintain, you were able to do your job, it meant you didn't care. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Acknowledged. Now put this on record, Peabody. You followed orders, you followed procedure. You were not at fault for what happened tonight. You could not have prevented it. Now put it aside, so we can find out why she's dead. Eve thought that a cop's daughter knew when another cop knocked on the door at 5 a.m, it was with news of the worst kind. She saw, the minute Brenda recognized her, that she was right. Oh, God. Oh, God, Mama? No, it's not your mother, Ms. Wojcinski. There was only one way, Eve knew, and that was fast. It's Alice. May we come in? Alice! She blinked glazed eyes, propped a hand on the door for balance. Alice? I think we should go inside. As gently as possible, Eve took her arm, stepped through the door. Let's go in and sit down. Alice? She said again. Grief cracked the glaze over her eyes. Tears poured through. Oh, no. Not my Alice. Not my baby. Brenda swayed and would have slid to the floor, but Eve tightened her grip and headed quickly for the nearest seat. I'm sorry. I am so sorry for your loss, Ms. Wojcinski. There was an accident early this morning, and Alice was killed. An accident? No. You've made a mistake. It was someone else. It wasn't Alice. She clutched at Eve, flooded eyes pleading. You can't be sure it was my Alice. It was. I'm sorry. She collapsed then, burying her face in her hands, pressing her hands to her knees so her body was balled in a defensive shield. I could make her some tea, Peabody murmured. Yeah, go. It was the part of the job that made Eve feel the most helpless, the most inadequate. There was no solution for fresh grief. Is there someone I can call for you? Do you want me to contact your mother, your brother? Mama. Oh, God, Alice, how will we bear it? There was no answer for that, Eve thought. Yet they would. Life demanded it. I can give you a soother, or could contact your doctor, if you'd prefer. Mom? As Brenda continued to rock, Eve looked over. The boy stood in the doorway, blinking sleepy, confused eyes. His hair was tousled from sleep, and he wore grubby sweatpants with holes at the knees. Alice's brother, Eve remembered. She'd forgotten. Then he focused on Eve, his eyes suddenly alert and much too adult. What's wrong? He demanded. What's happened? What the hell was his name? Eve struggled to remember, then decided it didn't matter at the moment. She rose. He was a tall boy, she realized, with sleep creases in his cheeks and a body already braced to take the worst. There's been an accident. I'm sorry, but it's Alice. His chin quivered, but his eyes stayed steady on hers. She's dead. Yes, I'm sorry. He continued to stare at her as Peabody came in with a cup of tea, set it awkwardly on the table. What kind of accident? She was hit by a car early this morning. Hit and run? No. Eve watched him carefully, considering. She stepped into the path of a cab. The driver was unable to stop. We're in the process of analyzing his vehicle and the scene, but there was a witness who corroborates the driver's statement. I don't believe he was at fault. He didn't attempt to flee the scene, and his driving record is clean. The boy simply nodded, dry-eyed, while his mother's weeping filled the room. I'll take care of her. It'd be best if you left us alone now. All right. If you have any questions, you can reach me at Cop Central. I'm Lieutenant Dallas. I know who you are. Leave us alone now, he repeated, and went to sit by his mother. The kid knows something, Eve stated as they stepped outside. That would be my take. Maybe Alice felt more comfortable talking to him than other members of the family. They were pretty close in age. Brothers and sisters squabble, but they confide in each other. I wouldn't know. She started her car, pined for coffee. Where the hell do you live, Peabody? Why? I'll drop you at home. You can catch some sleep, report to Central at 11. Is that what you're going to do? Catch some sleep? Yeah. That was probably a lie, but it served her purposes. Which way? I live on Houston. Eve winced only a little. Well, if it's going to be inconvenient, it might as well be way inconvenient. She headed south. Houston? Peabody, you bohemian. It was my cousin's place. When she decided to move to Colorado and weave rugs, I took it over. Rent control. A likely story. You probably spend all your free time hanging at poetry bars and performance art clubs. Actually, I prefer the mating lounges. Better food. You'd probably get more sex if you didn't think about it so much. No, I tried that too. She yawned, abruptly and hugely. Sorry. You're entitled. When you report in, check on the status of the autopsy. I want to be sure there's nothing weird in the tox report, and make sure to change out of that silly dress. Peabody shifted on her seat. It's not that silly. A couple guys at the aquarium seemed to like it. So did Rourke. Yeah, he mentioned it. Jaw dropped. Peabody swiveled her head. He did? Really? Foolishness, Eve thought, helped soothe. He said something about you looking appealing, so I hit him, just in case. Appealing? Jesus! Peabody patted her heart. I'm going to have to dig through some of the other stuff my mother's made for me. Appealing, she sighed. Rourke doesn't have any brothers, cousins, uncles, does he? As far as I know, Peabody, he's one of a kind. She found him dozing. Not in bed, but on the sofa in the sitting area of the master suite. The moment she stepped into the room, his eyes opened. You've had a long, rough one, Lieutenant. He reached out a hand. Come here. I'm going to grab a shower, some coffee. I've got some calls to make. He'd tagged onto the police scanner and knew exactly what she'd been dealing with. Come here, he repeated, and closed his hand over hers when she reluctantly obliged. Are the calls going to make any difference if you make them an hour from now? No, but... So he tugged until she tumbled onto the sofa with him. Because her struggle was only half-hearted, he managed to snuggle her down beside him quickly, and wrapping an arm around her, he kissed her hair. Sleep a little, he said quietly. There's no need to exhaust yourself. She was so young, Rourke. I know. Close it off, just for a little while. The data, Frank's log, did you find anything? We'll talk about it after you sleep. An hour, just an hour. Linking her fingers with his, she let herself go under. Chapter 5. Sleep helped. So did the hot shower and the food Rourke ordered up. Eve shoveled eggs into her mouth as she studied the data he'd unearthed on screen. More like a diary than an investigative log, she decided. Lots of personal comments, and obviously he was worried about Alice. I'm not sure how deeply they've influenced her mind or hurt her heart. He was thinking like a grandfather, not like a cop. You got this off his home unit? Yes. He had it coded and passkeyed. I suspect he didn't want his wife stumbling across it. If he had it coded, how did you access? Rourke took a cigarette from a carved box, studied it. You don't really want me to explain that, do you, Lieutenant? No. Eve forked up more eggs. Guess not. Still, his personal thoughts and worries aren't going to be a lot of help. I need to know what he found out and how far his private investigation went before he died. There's more. Rourke scrolled over dates. There. He talks about tailing Selina Cross and lists some of her, associates. But there's nothing there. He suspects she's dealing illegals. He believes she's holding unacceptable ceremonies in her club and perhaps her home.
He observes suspicious characters coming and going, but he bases it all on emotion, no facts. Frank had been off the streets too long. Eve set her plate aside and rose. If he didn't want to involve cops, why the hell didn't he at least hire a PI to handle the legwork? What's this? Frowning, she stepped closer to the screen and read aloud. I think she made me. Can't be sure, but it's almost as though she's leading me along now. I'm going to have to make a move soon. Alice is terrified, begging me to stay away from Cross and from her. The poor kid spends too much time with that Isis character. Isis may be a harmless weirdo, but she can't be a good influence on Alice. I've told Sally I'm working late. Tonight, I'm going in. Cross spends Thursday nights at the club. The apartment should be empty. If I can get inside and find anything at all to prove Alice saw a child murdered, I can report to Whitney anonymously. She's going to pay for what she and her filthy lover did to my little girl. One way or the other, she's going to pay. Christ! Nighttime breaking and entering? Illegal search and seizure? Frustrated, Eve dragged both hands through her hair. What the hell was he thinking? He had to know that anything he found would get tossed out in court. He'd never nail them this way. I have a feeling he wasn't worried about court, Eve. He wanted justice. And now he's dead, isn't he? And so's Alice. Where's the rest? Rourke scrolled to the last entry. Eve read, Security's too tight on the building. Couldn't get through it. I've been off the streets too damn long. I may have to tag someone to help me on this after all. I'm going to see that witch pays if it's the last thing I do. That's all on this. That entry was logged on the night before he died. There may be more, under a different code. So he hadn't made her pay, Eve thought. And he hadn't had time to get help. Not enough time, she thought again, with twin surges of relief and sorrow. The entries went a long way toward clearing both Frank and Feeney. But you don't think so. You don't think there's anything else. No, I don't. There's the timing, of course. And he wasn't that clever with electronics, Rourke explained. It was child's play to find this. Still, we'll look. It'll take some time to break through if there's anything there, and it'll have to be later. I have several meetings this morning. She turned to him. Odd, she realized. She'd forgotten for a moment. He wasn't working with her. His business and the direction of it was in a much different sphere from hers. So many billions, so little time. How true. But I should be able to fiddle a bit more this evening. She knew he hadn't so much as glanced at the stock reports or taken the morning calls that never failed to come in daily. I'm taking up a lot of your time. You are indeed. He came around the console, leaned back against it. And the payment will be your time, Lieutenant. A day or two away when we can both manage it. Then his smile faded. He took her hand, ran his thumb over the carving on her wedding ring. Eve, I don't like to interfere with your work, but I'll ask you to be particularly careful in this matter. A good cop's always careful. No, Rourke said, looking into her eyes. She's not. She's courageous, she's smart, she's driven, but she's not always careful. Sorry, I've dealt with worse than Selina Cross. She kissed him lightly. I've got to go in, check on some reports. I'll try to let you know if I'm going to be late. Do that, he murmured, and watched her go. She was wrong, he mused. He doubted very much if she'd ever dealt with worse than Selina Cross, and he had no intention of letting her deal with it alone. Moving to the link, Rourke called his assistant and arranged to have all his off-planet and out-of-town trips for the next month canceled. He intended to stay very close to home, and his wife. No drugs, Eve stated, as she looked over the toxicology report on Alice. No alcohol. She wasn't under the influence. But you heard her talking to someone who wasn't there, and she runs out into the path of an oncoming cab. She's worked herself up into a state of terror, then was triggered by the chanting on the phone. They knew how to get to her, how to manipulate her. It's not illegal to chant over a link. No, Eve considered. But it is illegal to threaten to harm over a public transmitter. That's reaching, Peabody returned, and it's only a misdemeanor. It's a start. If we manage to tie the transmission to Selina Cross, we can hassle her.
In any case, I think it's time we met. How about a little trip to hell, Peabody? I've been dying to go. Who isn't? But before she could rise, Feeney burst into her office. His eyes were shadowed, his face unshaven. Why are you primary on Alice's case? A traffic accident? Why the hell is a homicide lieutenant handling a traffic fatality? Feeney, she was my goddaughter. You didn't even call me. I heard it on the goddamn news. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Sit down, Feeney. He jerked away when she touched his arm. I don't need to sit down. I want answers, Dallas. I want some fucking answers. Peabody, Eve murmured, and waited until her aide had gone out and closed the door. I am sorry, Feeney. I didn't know you were a godfather. I spoke to her mother and her brother and simply assumed they would let the rest of the family know. Brenda's under sedation, Feeney tossed out. What the hell do you expect? She lost her father and her daughter within days of each other. Jamie's only 16. By the time he called the doctor and saw to his mother, got a hold of Sally, I'd already heard it on screen. Jesus, she was just a kid. He turned away, pulled at his hair. I used to give her piggyback rides. Sneaker candy. This was what it was like to lose someone you loved, she thought. And she was grateful she loved so few. Please sit down, Feeney. You shouldn't have come in today. I said I don't need to sit down. His voice leveled as he turned back to study her. I want an answer, Dallas. Why are you on Alice's accident? She couldn't afford to hesitate, couldn't afford not to lie. Peabody was a witness, she began, grateful she could give him that much. She was on a free evening, and she'd been to a club. She saw the accident. It shook her, Feeney, and she called me. It was knee-jerk, I guess. I couldn't be sure what had happened, so I told her to relay to dispatch to secure the scene, and I responded. Since I had all the data, I notified next of kin. I figured it would be easier on the family if I handled it. She moved her shoulders, bitterly ashamed at using old friends. I thought it was the least I could do. For Frank. He never took his eyes off her face. Is that all of it? What else is there? Listen, I just got the tox report. She wasn't using, Feeney. She wasn't drunk. Maybe she was still upset about Frank or something else. I don't know. Could be she didn't even see the damn cab. It was a lousy night. Fog, rain. The bastard was speeding, wasn't he? No. She couldn't give him anyone to blame. Couldn't even offer that prickly comfort. He was within the limit. His record's clean, and so was the on-site drug and alcohol. Feeney, she bolted out in front of him, and there was nothing he could do. I want you to understand that. I talked with the driver myself, and I investigated the scene. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't anyone's. It had to be someone's, he thought. He couldn't lose two people back-to-back for no reason. I want to talk to Peabody. Give her a little time, will you? Layers of guilt added onto the burden she already carried. It really wrecked her. I'd really like to keep her focused on something else until she settles with it. He drew a deep breath, shuddered it out. Beneath his erring grief was gratitude that someone he trusted would care for his godchild. You'll close it then, personally, and give me all the data? I'll close it, Feeney, I promise you. He nodded, rubbed his hands over his face. Okay. I'm sorry I jumped you. It's all right. It doesn't matter. She hesitated, then put her hand on his arm, squeezed lightly. Go home, Feeney. You don't want to be here today. I guess I will. He put a hand on the door. She was a sweetheart, Dallas, he said quietly. My God, I don't want to go to another funeral. When he left, Eve sank into her chair. Misery and guilt and anger twisted around her throat like barbs. She rose again, grabbed her bag. She was, she told herself, in the perfect mood to meet Selina Cross. How do you want to play it? Peabody asked, as they pulled up in front of an elegant old building downtown. Straight. I want her to know Alice talked to me, and that I suspect her of harassment, dealing, and conspiracy to murder. If she's got any brains, she'll know I don't have anything solid. But I'll give her something to think about. Eve stepped out of the car. ran her gaze over the building, with its carved glass windows and grinning gargoyles. She lives here. She's not hurting financially. We're going to have to find out just where she gets her money. I want everything on record, Peabody, and keep your eyes open. I want your impressions. I'll give you one right now. Peabody clamped her recorder onto her uniform jacket, but kept her eyes on the topmost window of the building, a wide, round glass, intricately carved. That's another inverted pentagram, satanic symbol, and those gargoyles don't look friendly. She smiled wanly. You ask me, they look hungry. Impressions, Peabody. Try to keep the fantasies down to a minimum. Eve approached the security screen. Please state your name and your business. Lieutenant Eve Dallas, an aide NYPSD. She held up her badge to be scanned. To see Selina Cross. Are you expected? Oh, I don't think she'll be surprised. One moment. While she waited, Eve studied the street. There was plenty of pedestrian and vehicular traffic, she noted, but most of those who walked used the other side of the street, and many of those eyed her and the building warily. Oddly, there wasn't a single glide-a-grill or street hawker in sight. You are cleared to enter, Lieutenant. Please proceed to Elevator 1. It is already programmed. Fine. Eve looked up, caught the shadow of movement behind the topmost glass. Look official, Peabody, she murmured, as they approached the heavily grilled front doors. We're under observation. The grills slid back. Locks snicked open. The light on a recessed security panel blinked from red to green. A lot of hardware for an apartment building, Peabody commented, and ignoring the fluttering in her stomach, stepped in behind Eve. Like a viewing parlor, the lobby area was heavily into red. A two-headed serpent slithered over the blood-red carpet. The gold threads of its eyes glinted as it watched a black-robed figure slice a curved knife over the throat of a white goat. Lovely art. Eve lifted a brow as Peabody carefully picked her way around the snake. Wool doesn't bite. You can't be too careful. She glanced back as they stepped to the elevator. I really hate snakes. My brother used to catch them out in the woods and chase me with them. Always had a phobia. The ride up was smooth and fast, but it gave Eve enough time to detect yet another security camera in the small black-mirrored car. The doors opened into a spacious foyer with floors of black marble. Twin red velvet settees flanked an archway and boasted carved arms of snarling wolves. A floral arrangement speared out of a pot shaped like a boar's head. Wolfbane, Peabody said quietly. Belladonna, foxglove, skullcap, peyote. She shrugged at Eve's considering look. My mother's an amateur botanist. I can tell you that's not your usual flower arrangement. But the usual is so tedious, isn't it? They got their first face-to-face look at Selina Cross exactly as she wanted to be seen. Flanked by the archway in a snug black dress that brushed the floor, her feet bare with the toenails painted a violent red, she posed, smiled. Her skin was vampire white, the slash of red over her full lips glossy as fresh blood. Her eyes glittered green and feline in a narrow, undoubtedly witch-like face that wasn't beautiful, but was eerily compelling. Her hair fell, black against black, from that rigid center part to her waist. The hand she gestured with held rings on every finger and her thumb. A silver chain was attached to each and twisted into an intricate mesh over the back of her hand. Lieutenant Dallas and Officer Peabody, isn't it? What interesting visitors on such a dull day. Will you come in to my parlor? Are you alone, Miss Cross? It would simplify this if we could speak with Mr. Alban as well. Oh, what a shame. She turned, silks whispering, and slipped through the arch. Alban's busy this morning. Sit down. She gestured again, encompassing a generous room crowded with furniture. Every seat boasted the heads or claws or beaks of some predator. Can I offer you something? We'll skip the refreshments. Considering it apt, Eve chose a chair with the arms of a hound. Not even coffee? That is your drink, isn't it?" Then she shrugged, flicked a fingertip over the pentagram above her eyebrow. "But suit yourself." With that same studied skill, she lowered to a curved settee that stood on cloven feet and draped her long arms over the back. "Now, what can I do for you?" "Alice Lindstrom was killed early this morning." "Yes, I know." She continued to smile pleasantly, as though discussing the nice run of weather. "I could tell you I witnessed the accident through my scrying mirror, but I doubt you'd believe that. Of course, I'm not one to disdain technology, and often watch the news and other forms of entertainment on screen. The information's been public for hours." "You knew her?" "Of course. She was a pupil of mine for a time, a dissatisfactory one, as it turned out. Alice complained to you about my tutelage?" It wasn't formed as a question, but she waited, as if for an answer. "If you mean she reported to me that she was drugged, sexually abused, and was a witness to an atrocity, then yes, she complained." "Drugs, sex, and atrocities." Selina let out a low, purring laugh. What an imagination our little Alice had. A shame she couldn't use it to broaden her vision. "How is your imagination, Lieutenant Dallas?" She flicked the hand gloved with mesh. In a small marble fireplace, flames burst to life. Peabody jolted, didn't manage to muffle a yelp, but neither woman acknowledged her. They continued to stare, unblinking at each other. "Or may I call you Eve?" "No, you can call me Lieutenant Dallas." "It's a little warm for a fire, don't you think? And a bit early in the day for parlor tricks." "I like it warm." "You have excellent nerves, Lieutenant." "I also have low tolerance for grifters and dealers and child killers." "Am I all of that?" Selina tapped her sharp red nails on the back of the settee, her only outward sign of annoyance in Eve's lack of response. "Prove it." "I will. Where were you last night between the hours of 1 and 3 a.m.? "I was here, in my ritual room, with Alban and a young initiate we call Lobar. We were engaged in a private sexual ceremony from midnight until nearly dawn. Lobar is young and enthusiastic." "I'll want to talk to them both." "You can contact Lobar any evening between 8 and 11 at our club. As for Alban, I don't keep his schedule, but he is generally here or at the club most nights. Unless you believe in magic, Lieutenant, you're wasting your time. I could hardly have been here, fucking 2 very entertaining men, and out-luring poor Alice to her death." "Is that what you consider yourself? A magician?" Eve glanced toward the still-burning fire with a mild sneer. "That's nothing more than trickery and distraction of the eye. You can be licensed to juggle on the streets for 2,000 credits a year." Selina's muscles quivered as she sat forward. Her eyes were burning now, as the fire did. "I am a high priestess of the Dark Lord. Our numbers are legion, and I have powers that would make you weep." "I don't cry easily, Ms. Cross." Ah, a temper, Eve thought with satisfaction, an easily ruffled pride. "You're not dealing with an impressionable 18-year-old girl now, or her frightened grandfather. Which one of your legion called Alice last night and played a tape of chanting threats?" "I have no idea what you're talking about, and you're beginning to bore me." The black feather on the windowsill was a nice touch, or simulated feather, I should say, but she wouldn't have known that. "Are you into droid pets, Miss Cross?" Idly, Selina lifted a hand, skimmed it through, then down her hair. "I don't care for pets at all." "No? No cats and ravens? How predictable that would be." "Alice believed you were a shape-shifter," Eve said, and watched as Selina smiled. "Care to give us a demonstration of that little talent?" Selina's nails began to tap again. Eve's tone was as insulting as a backhanded slap. "I'm not here to entertain you, or to be mocked by your small mind." "Is that what you call it? Were you entertaining Alice with cats and birds and threatening chants over her link? How could she feel safe in her own home? Was she such a threat to you?" "She was nothing to me but an unfortunate failure. You were seen selling illegals to Frank Wojcinski." The abrupt switch had Selina blinking. When her lips curved now, the smile didn't reach her eyes. "If that were true, we wouldn't be having this discussion here in my home, but an interview. I'm an herbalist, again licensed, and I often sell or trade perfectly legal substances. Do you grow your herbs here? As a matter of fact, I do, and distill my potions and medications. I'd like to see them. Why don't you show me your work area? You'll need a warrant for that, and we both know you haven't cause for one." "You're right. I guess that's why Frank didn't bother with a warrant." Eve rose slowly, spoke softly. "You knew he was onto you. But did you suspect he might get in here? Inside?" "You didn't see that in your magic ball, did you?" Eve said, when Selina's breath shortened and thickened. "What would you think if I told you he was in your house, and he documented what he saw and what he found?" "You have nothing. Nothing." Selina sprang to her feet. "He was an aging man with slow wits and bad reflexes. I made him for a cop the first time he tried to tail me. He was never in my home. He told you nothing when he was alive, and he can't tell you anything now. No? Don't you believe in talking to the dead, Miss Cross? I make my living at it. And do you think I don't recognize smoke and mirrors, Lieutenant?" Her spectacular breasts strained against the material of her dress as she struggled to even her breathing. "Alice was a foolish girl who believed she could flirt with dark forces, then run back to her pathetic white magic and tidy little family. She paid the price for her ignorance and her cowardice, but not at my hand. I have nothing more to say to you." "That'll do for now. Peabody?" She started toward the archway. "Your fire's going out, Ms. Cross," she said mildly. "Pretty soon you're going to have nothing but a mess of ashes." Selina stood where she was, shaking with rage. When the door closed and security engaged, she balled her hands into fists and screamed with temper. A panel on the wall slid open. The man who stepped out was tall and golden. His chest gleamed and rippled with muscle. The tattoo over his heart was of a horned goat. He wore only an open black robe carelessly belted at the waist with silver cord. "Alban!" Selina ran to him, threw her arms around him. "There, my love." His voice was deep, soothing. On the hand that stroked her hair was a large silver ring carved with an inverted pentagram. "You mustn't unbalance your chakras." "Fuck my chakras!" She was weeping now, wildly, pounding on him like a child in a blind tantrum. "I hate her! I hate her! She has to be punished!" With a sigh, he let her go to storm the room, cursing, smashing crockery. He knew the temper would pass more quickly if he stood back and let it purge. "I want her dead, Alban! Dead! I want her to suffer agonies, to scream for mercy, to bleed and writhe and bleed! She insulted me. She challenged me. She all but laughed in my face." "She doesn't believe, Selina. She has no vision." Exhausted as always after a fit of temper, she collapsed on the settee. "Cops! I've hated them all my life." "I know." He picked up a tall, slim bottle, poured her some thick, cloudy liquid. "We'll have to be careful with her. She's very high profile." He passed her a chalice. "But we'll think of something, won't we?" "Of course we will." She smiled again, sipped slowly at the brew. "Something very special. The master would want something inventive in her case." Now she laughed, full-throated, head thrown back. The police had been the bane of her existence until she discovered a higher power. "We'll make a believer out of her, won't we, Alban?" "She'll believe." She drank deeply now, felt the lovely haze coat her tangled emotions, and let the chalice drop. "Come here and take me." Eyes glittering, she slid down. "Force me." And when he covered her body with his, she turned her head, bared her teeth, and dug them into his shoulder to draw blood. "Hurt me," she demanded. "With pleasure," he replied. And when they lay apart, their violent passions sated, he lay quiet beside her. She would revive now, he knew. She would cool, and she would calm, and she would think. "We should perform a ceremony tonight. Call together the entire coven for a black mass.
We need power, Alban. She isn't weak, and she wants to destroy us.
She won't. With affection now, he stroked her cheek. She can't. After all, she's only a cop with no past and a limited future. But you're right, of course. We'll call the coven. We'll perform the rite, and I think we'll provide Lieutenant Dallas with a distraction or two. She won't have the time or inclination to worry over much about little Alice for long. Fresh arousal rippled through her, a dark wave that flooded into her eyes. Who dies? My love. He lifted her, speared her, sighed when her muscles clamped viciously around him. You have only to choose.
You really pissed her off.
Peabody struggled to ignore the light sweat of fear that dried on her skin as Eve drove away from the building. That was the idea. Now that I know control isn't her strong point, I'll be sure to piss her off again. She's all ego, Eve decided. Imagine, thinking we'd fall for a second-rate trick like the fire.
Yeah,
Peabody managed a sickly smile.
Imagine.
Eve tucked her tongue in her cheek and decided against ragging on her aide. Since we're into witches, let's swing by and check out this Isis at Spirit Quest. She slid her eyes right. Well, maybe she'd rag just a little. You can probably buy a talisman or some herbs, she said solemnly. You know, to ward off evil. Peabody shifted in her seat. Feeling foolish wasn't nearly as bad as worrying about being cursed.
Don't think I won't.
After we deal with Isis, we can grab a pizza sub, with plenty of garlic.
Garlic's for vampires.
Oh, we can have Rourke get us a couple of his antique guns, with silver bullets.
Werewolves, Dallas.
Amused at both of them now, Peabody rolled her eyes.
A lot of good you're going to do if we have to defend ourselves against witchcraft.
What does it to witches, then?
I don't know, Peabody admitted, but I'm damn sure going to find out.
Chapter 6. Shopping wasn't something Eve considered one of the small pleasures in life. She wasn't a browser, a window shopper, or an electronic catalog surfer. She avoided, whenever possible, the shops and boutiques in, above, and below Manhattan. She shuddered at the very thought of a trip to one of the sky malls. She imagined her outward resistance to the consumption of merchandise was the primary reason Isis pegged her as a cop the minute she stepped into Spirit Quest. As stores went, Eve considered it tolerable. She wasn't interested in the crystals and cards, the statues and candles, even though they were attractively displayed. The background music was soft, more of a murmur than a tune, and the light was allowed to play over the edges of raw crystals and polished stones and pretty rainbows. The place smelled, she thought, not offensively of forest. If witches were what she was dealing with, Eve decided, Isis and Selina couldn't have been more dramatically opposed in appearance. Selina had been pale and slim and feline. Isis was an exotic Amazon of a female with gypsy curls of flaming red, round black eyes, and cheeks that could have carved wood. Her skin was the soft gold of a mixed-race heritage, her features bold and broad. Eve measured her at just over 6 feet and a well-packed and curvy 170. She wore a loose, flowing robe of blinding white, with a belt studded with rough stones. Her right arm was wound with gold coils from elbow to shoulder, and her large hands winked and flashed with as many as a dozen rings. Welcome. Her voice suited her, oddly accented and throaty. Her lips curved, but it was a smile of grieving rather than pleasure. Alice's cop. Eve lifted a brow as she took out her shield. She figured she looked like a cop, and since Rourke, her face had been in the media relentlessly. Dallas. You'd be Isis, then? I would. You'll wish to talk. Excuse me. She walked to the door. Graceful, Eve observed, the way an athlete is graceful. She turned an old-fashioned, hand-lettered sign to closed, pulled the shade over the glass of the door, and flicked a thumb latch. When she turned back, her eyes were intense, her mouth grim. You bring dark shadows into my light. She clings. Such a stench. At Eve's narrowed look, she inclined her head. Selina, one moment. She went to a wide shelf and began to light candles and cones of incense. To purify and shield, to protect and defend. You have shadows of your own, Dallas. She smiled briefly at Peabody. And not just your aid. I'm here to talk about Alice. Yes, I know. And you're impatient with what you see as my foolish window dressing. I don't mind. Every religion should be open to questions and change. Will you sit? She gestured to a corner, where 2 chairs flanked a round table etched with symbols. Again she smiled at Peabody. I can get another chair from the back for you. No problem. I'll stand. She couldn't help it. Her gaze traveled the room, lingering now and then wistfully on some pretty bauble. Please feel free to browse. We're not here to shop. Eve took a seat, shot Peabody a withering glance. When did you last see or speak with Alice? On the night she died. At what time? I believe it was about 2 a.m. She was already dead, Isis added, folding her large, beautiful hands. You saw her after she was dead. Her spirit came to me. You find this foolish. I understand. But I can only tell you what is and was. I was asleep, and I awoke. She was there, beside the bed. I knew we'd lost her. She feels she's failed. Herself, her family, me. Her spirit is restless and full of grief. Her body's dead, Isis. That's my concern. Yes. Isis picked up a smooth, rose-colored stone from the table, worried it in her hand. Even for me, with my beliefs, it's difficult to accept her death. So young, so bright. The huge dark eyes swam. I loved her very much, as you would a younger sister. But it wasn't meant for me to save her in this life. Her spirit will return, be reborn. I know we'll meet again. Fine. Let's concentrate on this life, and this death. Isis blinked back the tears and managed a quick, genuine smile. How tedious you must find all of this. You have such a logical mind. I want to help you, Dallas. For Alice. For myself, perhaps for yourself as well. I recognize you. I gathered that. No, from another time, another place, another plane. She spread her hands. I last saw Alice alive on the day of her grandfather's memorial service. She blamed herself, was determined to make an atonement. She'd strayed for a time, been misled, but she had a strong and bright heart. Her family was dear to her, and she was afraid, desperately afraid of what Selina would do to her, body and soul. You know Selina Cross? Yes, we've met. In this life, Eve asked dryly, and made Isis smile again. In this life, and others. She's no threat to me, but she is dangerous. She seduces the weak, the confused, and those who prefer her way. Her claims to be a witch, she is no witch. Isis drew her shoulders back, lifted her head. We who embrace the craft do so in the light and live by an unbreakable code. And it harm none. She used what pitiful power she has to call on the dark, to exploit its violence, its ugliness. We know what evil is, Dallas. We've both seen it. Whatever form it takes doesn't change its basic nature. We can agree on that. Why would she harm Alice? Because she could. Because she would enjoy it. There's no question that she's responsible for this death. You won't find it easy to prove it. You won't give up. Isis kept her eyes on Eve's, looking long, looking deep. Selina will be surprised and infuriated by your tenacity, your strength. Death offends you, and the death of the young cuts small slices from your heart. You remember too well, but not all. You weren't born Eve Dallas, but you've become her, and she you. When you stand by the dead, stand for the dead. Nothing moves you aside. His death was necessary for your life,
"Stop," Eve ordered.
"Why should it haunt you?" Isis's breathing was slow and thick, her eyes dark and clear. "The choice was made correctly. Innocence was lost, but strength took its place. For some it must be so. You'll need all before this cycle passes. A wolf, a boar, and a silver blade. Fire, smoke, and death. Trust the wolf, slay the boar, and live." Abruptly, she blinked. Her eyes clouded as she lifted a hand to press fingers to her temple. "I'm sorry, I didn't intend—" She let out a quiet moan, squeezed her eyes shut. "Headache, vicious, excuse me 1 minute." She got shakily to her feet and hurried into the back.
"Jesus, Dallas, this is getting way too weird. Do you know what she was talking about?"
"His death was necessary for your life." Her father, Eve thought, fighting off a shudder. A cold room, a dark night, and blood on the knife clutched in a desperate child's hand. "No, it's just gibberish." Her palms were damp, infuriating her. "These people figure they have to pull out some magic tricks to keep us interested." "I studied at the Kaczynski Institute in Prague," Isis said as she stepped back into the room, "and was studied." She set a small cup aside, managed to smile as the headache eased. "My psychic abilities are documented for those who need documentation. But I apologize, Dallas. I didn't intend to drift in that manner. It's very rare for it to happen without my consciously controlling it." She came back to sit as she spoke, spread the skirts of her robe gracefully. "It would be sheer hell to be privy to thoughts and memories without some power to control and block. I don't like to pry into personal thoughts. And it hurts," she added, gently rubbing her temple again. "I want to help you do what Alice wanted, so she can rest. I want, for personal and selfish reasons, to see Selina pay the proper price for what she's responsible for. I'll do whatever I can, whatever you'll allow me to do to help you." Trust didn't come easily for Eve, and she would check very thoroughly into Isis's background. But for now, she'd use her. "Tell me what you know about Selina Cross." "I know she's a woman without conscience or morals. I would think your term would be sociopath, but I find that too simple and too clean for what she is. I prefer the more direct term of evil. She's a clever woman with a skill for reading weaknesses. As for her power, what she can read or see or do, I can't say." "What about Alban?" "About him I know next to nothing. She keeps him close. I assume he's her lover, and she finds him useful, or she would have dispatched him by now." "This club of hers?" Isis smiled thinly. "I don't frequent such establishments." "But you know of it." "One hears rumors, gossip." She lifted her broad shoulders. "Dark ceremonies, black masses, the drinking of blood, human sacrifice, rape, murder, infanticide, the calling up of demons." Then she sighed. "But then you might hear such talk about Wiccans from those who have no understanding of the craft, and who see black-draped crone, eye of newt, when they think of witches." "Alice claimed to have seen a child murdered." "Yes, and I believe she did. She couldn't have invented such a thing. She was in shock and ill when she came to me." Isis pressed her lips together, shuddered out of breath. "I did what I could for her." "Such as encouraging her to report the incident to the police?" "That was for her to decide." Isis lifted her chin again, met the iced anger in Eve's eyes. "I was more concerned with her emotional and spiritual survival. The child was already lost. I had hoped to save Alice from the same fate." Her eyes dropped now and dampened. "And I regret bitterly that I didn't act differently, and that in the end I failed her." "Perhaps it was pride." She looked at Eve again. "You'd understand the power and the deception of personal pride. I thought I could handle it, that I was wise enough, strong enough. I was wrong. So, Dallas, to atone, I'll do anything you ask, avail you of all knowledge and any power the goddess grants me." "Information will do." Eve angled her head.
Selina treated us to a little demonstration of what she'd call power. It impressed Peabody. It caught me off guard, Peabody muttered, studying Isis warily. She didn't think she was up for another demonstration. To Peabody's surprise and Eve's, Isis threw back her magnificent head and laughed. It was like hearing silver buoys clang in pearly fog. "Should I call up the wind?" With one hand pressed to her breast, she chuckled. "Summon the dead. Strike the cold fire." "Really, Dallas, you believe in none of that, so it would be a waste of my time and energy. But perhaps you'd be interested in observing one of our gatherings. We have one at the end of next week. I can arrange it." "I'll think about it." "You smirk," Isis said lightly, "yet the pledge you wear on your finger carries the ancient symbol of protection." "What?" "Your wedding ring, Dallas." With that quiet smile, Isis lifted Eve's left hand. It's carved with an old Celtic design for protection. Baffled, Eve studied the pretty etching and the slim gold ring. "It's just a design. It's a very specific and powerful one, to give the wearer protection from harm." Amused, she raised her brows. "I see you didn't know. Is it so surprising, really? Your husband has the blood of the Celts, and you lead a very precarious life. Rourke loves you very much, and you wear the symbol of it." "I prefer facts to superstitions," Eve said, and rose. "As you should," Isis agreed. "But you will be welcome at the next gathering, should you choose to attend. Rourke will also be welcome." She smiled at Peabody. "And your aid. Will you accept a gift?" "It's against the rules." "And rules are to be respected." Rising, Isis moved behind a display counter, took out a small clear bowl with a wide lip. "Then perhaps you will buy this. I have, after all, lost potential business by closing to speak to you. $20. "Fair enough." Eve dug into her pocket for credits. "What is it?" "We'll call it a worry bowl. In this you place all your pain, your sorrow, your worries. Set it aside and sleep without shadows." "Such a deal." Eve set the credits on the counter and waited for Isis to wrap the bowl in protective paper. Eve got home early, a rarity. She thought she could dive into work in the quiet of her home office. She could get past Somerset easily enough, she mused as she pulled up at the end of the drive. The butler would simply sniff and ignore her. She'd have a couple of hours clear to run data on Isis and to contact Dr. Mira's office and make an appointment with a psychiatrist. It would, Eve decided, be interesting to get Mira's take on personalities such as Selina Cross and Isis. Eve got no farther than the front door when her plans disintegrated. Music pounded, blasting out of the front parlor like compact nuclear explosions. Staggering against the waves, Eve slapped her hands over her ears and shouted. She didn't have to be told it was Mavis. No one else in her sphere would play clashing, discordant notes at that decibel. When she reached the doorway, the volume was still revved high. Her shouted demands reached neither the remote nor the single occupant of the room. Alone, decked out in a micro-robe of searing magenta that echoed the spiral curls shooting out of her head, Mavis Freestone lounged on the couch, doing the impossible. She slept like a baby. Jesus Christ! Since vocal commands were useless, Eve risked her eardrums and dropped her hands to fumble with the recessed control unit. "Off! Off! Off!" she shouted, stabbing buttons. The noise shut down in mid-blast and made her moan. Mavis's eyes popped open. "Hey, how's it going?" "What?" Eve shook her head to try to dispel the high-pitched ringing. "What?" "That was a new group I picked up this morning. Mayhem. Pretty decent." "What?" With a chuckle, Mavis unfolded her neat little body and bounced to a cabinet. "Looks like you could use a drink, Dallas. I must have zoned. Up pretty late the last few nights. Wanted to talk to you about stuff." "Your mouth is moving," Eve observed. "Are you talking to me?" "It wasn't that loud." "Have a drink." "Somerset said it would be all right if I hung for a while. Didn't know when you'd check in." For reasons that eluded Eve, the stiff-necked butler appeared to have a major crush on Mavis. "He's probably in his cage, composing odes to your legs." "Hey, it's nothing sexual. He just likes me." So,
Mavis clunked her glass against Eve's. "Rourke's not around, right?" "With that music blasting?" Eve snorted, sipped. "Figure it out." "Well, that's good, because I wanted to roll it out with you." But she sat, twisted the glass in her hands, and said nothing. "What's the problem? You and Leonardo have a fight or something?" No. You can't really fight with Leonardo. He's too sweet. He's in Milan for a few days. Some fashion deal." "Why didn't you go with him?" Eve sat, rested her booted feet on the priceless coffee table, crossed her ankles. "I've got the gig at the Down and Dirty. I wouldn't let Crack down after he bailed me." Eve rolled her shoulders and began to relax. Mavis's career as a performer, it was difficult to use the term singer when defining Mavis's talents, was moving along. There had been some serious roadblocks, but they'd been overcome. "I didn't figure you'd work there much longer, not with the recording contract." "Yeah, well, that's the thing. The contract. You know, after finding out Jess was using me, and you and Rourke, for his mind games, I didn't figure the demo I'd cut with him would go anywhere." "It was good, Mavis. Flashy, unique. That's why I got picked up." "Is it?" She rose again, a tiny woman with wild hair. "I found out today that Rourke owns the recording company that offered the contract." Gulping her drink, she paced away. "I know we go back a ways, Dallas, a long ways, and I appreciate you putting Rourke up to it, but I don't feel right about it. I wanted to thank you." She turned then, her silver eyes tragic and bleak, "and tell you that I'm going to turn it down." Eve pursed her lips. "Mavis, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Are you telling me that Rourke, the guy who lives here, is producing your disc?" "It's his company, Eclectic. It produces everything from classical to brain drain. It's the company. Totally mag, which is why I was so wired up about the deal." Eclectic, Eve mused. The company. It sounded just like him. "I don't know anything about it. I didn't ask him to do anything, Mavis." She blinked, lowered slowly to the arm of a chair. "You didn't? Solid?" "I didn't ask," Eve repeated, "and he didn't tell me." Which was also just like him. "I'd have to say that if his company is offering you a contract, it's because Rourke, or whoever he's put in charge of that stuff, figures you're worth it." Mavis took slow breaths. She'd worked herself up to the selfless sacrifice, unwilling to take advantage of friendship. Now she teetered. "Maybe he arranged it, like a favor." Eve cocked a brow. "Rourke's business is business. I'd say he figures you're going to make him richer, and if he did do it as a favor, which I doubt, then you'll just have to prove to him that you're worth it. Won't you, Mavis?" "Yeah." She let out a long breath. "I'm gonna kick ass. You wait and see." Her smile beamed out. "Maybe you could come by the D&D tonight? I've got some new material, and Rourke could get another close-up of his latest investment." "Have to pass tonight. I've got work. I've got to check out the Athame." Mavis grimaced. "What the hell are you going there for? Nasty place." "You know it? Only by rep, and the rep's down below bad news." "Someone I've got to talk to there, connected with the case I'm working on." She considered. There was no one she knew more likely to have a line on the unusual. "Know any witches, Mavis?" "Yeah, sort of. A couple of servers down at the Blue Squirrel were into it. Brushed a few way back when I was on the grift." "You believe in that stuff? Chanting and spells and palm reading?" Mavis cocked her head and looked thoughtful. "It's major bullshit." "You never failed to surprise me," Eve decided. "I figured you'd be into it. I ran a con once. Spirit guide. I was Ariel, reincarnation of a fairy queen. You'd be amazed how many straights paid up for me to contact their dead relatives or tell them their future." To demonstrate, she let her head fall back. Her eyes fluttered, her mouth went slack. Slowly, her arms lifted, palms turned up. "I feel a presence. Strong, seeking, sorrowful." Her voice had deepened, attained a faint accent. "There are dark forces working against you. They hide from you, wait to do harm. Beware." She dropped her arms and grinned. So you tell the Mark you need to have trust in order to offer protection from the dark forces. All they have to do is put, say, 1,000 cash is all that works, in an envelope. Seal it. You make sure you tell them to seal it with the special wax you're going to sell them. Then you're going to do this cool chant over it and bury the envelope in a secret place under the dark of the moon. After the moon's cycled, you'll dig up the envelope and give it back. The dark forces will have been vanquished. That's it? People just hand over the money? Well, you string it out a little longer. Do some research so you can hit them with names and events and shit. But basically, yeah, people want to believe. Why? Because life can really suck. Yes, Eve thought when she was alone again. She supposed it could. Hers certainly had for long stretches of time. Now she was living in a mansion with a man who, for some reason, loved her. She didn't always understand her life, or the man who now shared it, but she was adjusting. So well, in fact, that she decided not to go bury herself in work, but to go outside into the golden autumn evening and take an hour for herself. She was used to streets and sidewalks, crowded sky glides, jammed people movers. The sheer space Rourke could command always astonished her. His grounds were like a well-tended park, quiet and lush, with the foliage of rich man's trees and the dazzling flame of fall. The scents were of spicy flowers, the faintly smoky fragrance of October in the country. Overhead, the sky was nearly empty of traffic, and even that was a dignified hum. No rumbling airbuses or lumbering tourist blimps over Rourke's land. And the world she knew, and that knew her, was beyond the gates and over the walls, in the seamy dark. Here she could forget that for a short time, forget New York existed with its death and its anger, and its perpetually appealing arrogance. She needed the quiet and the air. As she walked over thick green grass, she worried the ring with its odd symbols on her finger. On the north side of the house was an arbor of thin, somehow fluid iron. The vines twisting and tumbling over it were smothered with flowers wildly red. She had married him there, in an old traditional ceremony where vows were exchanged and promises made. A ceremony, she thought now. A rite that included music, flowers, witnesses, words that were repeated time after time, place after place, century through century. And so, she thought, other ceremonies were preserved and repeated and believed to hold power. Back to Cain and Abel, she mused. One had planted crops, the other tended a flock, and both had offered sacrifice. One had been accepted, the other dismissed. Thus, she imagined, some would say good and evil were born, because each needed the balance and challenge of the other. So it continued, science and logic disproved, but the rites continued, incense and chanting, offerings and the drinking of wine that symbolized blood, and the sacrifice of the innocent. Annoyed with herself, she rubbed her hands over her face. Philosophizing was foolish and useless. Murder had been done by human force, and it was human force that would dispense justice. That was, after all, the ultimate balance of good and evil. She sat on the ground under the arbor of blood-red blossoms and drew a burning scent of evening. "This isn't usual for you?" Rourke came up quietly behind her, so quietly her heart gave a quick trip before he settled on the grass beside her. "Communing with nature? Maybe I spent too much time inside today." She had to smile when he handed her one of the red flowers. She twirled it in her fingers, watched it spin before she looked over at him. He was relaxed, his dark hair skimming his shoulders as he leaned back on his elbows, legs stretched out, feet crossed at the ankles. She imagined his pricey and beautiful suit would pick up grass stains that would horrify Somerset. He smelled male and expensive. Lust curled comfortably in her stomach. "Successful day?" she asked. "We'll have bread on the table another day or two." She flicked her fingers at the ends of his hair. "It's not the money, is it? It's the making it." "Oh, it's the money." His eyes laughed at her. "And the making it." In a quick move she told herself she should have seen coming, he reached up, cupped the back of her neck, and overbalanced her onto him and into a hot kiss. "Hold on!" She didn't squirm quickly enough and ended up under him. "I am." His mouth fastened greedily on her throat and sent little licks of heat straight down her body to her toes. "I want to talk to you." "Okay, you talk while I get you out of these clothes." "Still wearing your weapon?" he observed as he hit the release for the harness. "Thinking of zapping some wildlife?" "That's against city ordinance." "Rourke," she caught his wrist as his hand closed sneakily over her breast. "I want to talk to you. I want to make love with you. Let's see who wins." It should have infuriated her, the fact that he already had her shirt open and her breasts aching. Then his mouth closed over that sensitive flesh and had her eyes all but crossing in pleasure. Still, it wouldn't do to let him win too easily. She let her body go limp, moaned, and combed her fingers through his hair, ran them over his shoulders. "Your jacket," she murmured, and tugged at it. When he shifted to shrug free, she had him. It was a basic tenet of hand-to-hand. Never lower your guard. She scissored, shoved, and pinned him with a knee to the crotch and an elbow to the throat. "You're tricky." He calculated he could dislodge the elbow, but the knee— there were some things a man didn't care to risk. He kept his eyes on hers and slowly, carefully, skimmed his fingertips up her bare torso, circled her breast. "I admire that in a woman." "You're easy." His thumb brushed lightly over her nipple, quickening her breath. "I admire that in a man." "Well, you've got me now." He unsnapped her waistband, teased her stomach muscles to quiver. "Be kind." She grinned, levered her elbow away to brace her hands on either side of his head. "I don't think so." Lowering her head, she caught his mouth with hers. She heard his breath suck in, felt his arms come around her, fingers digging in. His groan thundered through her pulse. "Your knee?" he managed. Lust was full-blown now and raging. She shifted lips and teeth to his throat. "Your knee, darling." She moved to attack his ear and nearly unmanned him. "It's very effective." "Oh, sorry." Snorting, she lowered her knee, lowered her body, and let him roll her over. "Forgot. A likely story. You may have caused permanent damage." "Aw." With a wicked grin, she tugged open his trousers. "I bet we can make it all better." His eyes went dark when she stroked him, stayed open and on hers when their lips met again. This kiss, surprisingly tender, twined that terrifyingly strong emotion with the easy lust. The lower edges of the sky were as wildly red as the blossoms arching over them. The shadows were long and soft. She could hear bird song and the whisper of air through the dying leaves. The touch of his hands on her was like a miracle, chasing away all the ugliness and pain of the world she walked in. She didn't even know she needed to be soothed, he thought, as he stroked and he soothed, so that arousal was slow and warm and liquid. Perhaps neither had he, until they held like this, touched like this. The romance of the air, the light, the gradual surrender of a strong woman was gloriously seductive. He eased into her, watching her face as the first orgasm rolled through her, feeling her body clench, shudder, go pliant as his fueled it and filled it. She kept her eyes open, as fascinated by the intensity of his stare as the silvery ripples of sensation that pumped through her. She matched his pace, silky and smooth, even as her breath tore. And when she saw those dark Celtic eyes cloud, go opaque, she framed his face with her hands, pulled his mouth to hers to savor his long, long groan of release. When his body was ranged weightily over hers, his face buried in her hair, she wrapped her arms companionably around him. "I let you seduce me." "Aha." "I didn't want to hurt your feelings." "Thank you. You tolerated it all so stoically, too." "It's the training. Cops have to be stoic." He reached out, ran a hand over the grass, and plucked up her shield. "Your badge, Lieutenant." She snickered, slapped him on the ass. "Get off me. You weigh a ton. Keep sweet-talking me, and God knows what could happen." Lazily, he rolled aside, noted that the sky had gone from cloudy blue to pearl gray. "I'm starving. You distracted me, and now it's well past dinner time." "It's going to be a little more past." She sat up and began to tug on her clothes. "You had your sex, pal. Now it's my turn. We have to talk." "We could talk over dinner." He sighed when she sent him a steely stare. "Or we could talk here." "Problem?" he asked, and skimmed his thumb over the dent in her chin. "Let's just say I have some questions. I might have the answers. What are they?" "To begin with—" She broke off, blew out of breath. He was sitting there, mostly naked, looking very much like a sleek, well-satisfied cat. "Put some clothes on, will you? You're going to distract me." She tossed his shirt at him when he only grinned. "Mavis was waiting for me when I got home." "Oh?" He shook out his shirt, noted its deplorable condition, but slipped it on. "Why didn't she stay?" "She's got a gig at the Down and Dirty." "Rourke, why didn't you tell me you own Eclectic?" "It's not a secret." He hitched into his slacks, then handed her her weapon harness. "I own a number of things. You know what I'm talking about." She would be patient here, Eve told herself, because it was a delicate area for everyone. Eclectics offered Mavis a contract. "Yes, I know." "I know you know," she snapped, slapping away his hand as he attempted to smooth down her hair. "Damn it, Rourke, you should have told me. I'd have been prepared when she asked me about it." "Asked you what? It's a standard contract. She'll certainly want an agent or representative to look it over, but did you do it for me?" she interrupted, and her eyes were focused on his face. "Did I do what for you?" Now her teeth went on edge. "Offer Mavis the recording contract." He folded his hands, cocked his head. "You're not planning on giving up law enforcement to be a theatrical agent, are you?" "No, of course not. Well, then, it has nothing to do with you." "You're not going to sit there and tell me you like Mavis's music." "Music is a term I'm not sure applies to Mavis's talents." "There!" She jabbed a finger into his chest. "That talent, however, is, I believe, commercial. Eclectic's purpose is to produce and distribute commercial recording artists." She sat back, tapped her finger on her knee. "So it's a business thing. Straight business." "Naturally. I take business very seriously." "You could be snowing me," she said after a moment. "You're good enough." "Yes, I am." Pleased that he was one of the very few who could snow her, he smiled at her. "Either way, the deal's done." "Is that all?" "No." She hissed out a breath, then leaned forward and kissed him. "Thanks. Either way." "You're welcome." "Next, I have to hit the Athame tonight. Check a guy out." She saw the flicker in his eyes, the tensing of his jaw. "I'd like you to go with me." She had to bite her tongue to keep from snickering when he narrowed those eyes at her. "Just like that? It's police business, but you're not going to make an issue out of it?" "No. First, because I think you might be helpful, and second, because it saves time. We'd argue about it, and you'd just go anyway. This way, I ask you to come, and you go, understanding I'm in charge." "Clever of you." He took her hand and drew her to her feet. "Agreed. But after dinner. I missed lunch." "One more thing. Why did you have a Celtic symbol of protection carved into my wedding ring?" He felt the jolt of surprise, covered it smoothly. "Excuse me?" "No, you weren't quick enough that time." It pleased her that she'd spotted that minute and masterfully covered awareness. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. One of our friendly neighborhood witches tagged it today." "I see." Caught, he realized, and he stalled by lifting her hand to examine the ring. "It's an appealing design. Don't bullshit me, Rourke. I'm a professional." She stepped in until their eyes were level again. "You buy into it, don't you? You actually buy all this hocus-pocus." "It's not a matter of that." He fumbled, and knew it when she furrowed her brow. "You're embarrassed." Her brow cleared in surprise and amusement. "You're never embarrassed. By anything. This is weird." And kind of sweet. I'm not embarrassed. Mortified, he decided, but not embarrassed. I'm simply not entirely comfortable explaining myself. I love you, he said, and stilled her muffled chuckle. You risk your life, a life that's essential to me, just by being who you are. This, he brushed his thumb over her wedding band, is a small and very personal shield. That's lovely, Rourke. Really. But you don't really believe all that magic nonsense. His gaze lifted, and as twilight